Chapter 15, Discord 2-3. Chapter 8, Discord 2-3, 1994, 1995. Percy is 18 and 31, Harry is 14, and Severus is 34, and Voldemort is trapped in the form of a child. November 1994, Percy has spent the last few days thinking about it, and concluded that Tom would look best in oils. Traditional, decadent, a bit cold. He's not a particularly good oil painter, and so he manages to find an instructor through the incredibly expedient step of owling Narcissa Malfoy. She, predictably, knows everyone, and is even able to write him a letter of introduction. He resolutely does not think of how appalled his parents would be to know he voluntarily contacted the Malfoys for help. Art lessons are hardly evil, even if the subject himself may be. Surprisingly, he can even afford the lessons without dipping into his excess supply created by the Philosopher's Stone. He'd accuse the Malfoys of charity, except the only thing more unlikely than a Malfoy helping a Weasley is a Malfoy giving a Weasley money. Percy's ministry salary is as unused as it was the first time. At least one thing constant in both timelines is his utter inability to have a social life. November is otherwise lonely. Tonks is constantly busy, investigating the riots and trying to weasel the truth out of Mad-Eye Moody. Percy is not entirely convinced there is any truth to uncover. He'd looked up the report that Diggory had co-filed with Arthur, which seems to suggest that the only culprit in the whole affair is Moody himself, who had illegally cursed his dustbins to attack any intruders. Likely a stray cat, Diggory had scrawled at the end, and Arthur had written just under, "Dustbins removed. AM fined." Percy sends a copy of the report to Tonks, who steadfastly refuses to acknowledge that she is chasing after an easel. Percy feels embarrassed about Liam seeing him eat lunch alone, and so ends up often spending his lunch hour in the Library of Archives, trying to pinpoint where the orphanage that Tom lived may be. The library has huge shelves of every conceivable book and large boxes filled with miniaturized objects collected from centuries of society. Percy spends an entire afternoon distracted from his job, looking through a collection of old scrolls that past apprentices had submitted at the conclusion of their apprenticeship in a bid for master. How interesting it must have been to study magic back then, when so much of magical theory was left to be discovered. There is an entire work merely on the properties of the levitation charm, which Percy makes a copy of for his own perusal. Imagine the air hardening. However much time he spends choosing random boxes to peek into, he spends more time poring through maps of Muggle Britain, looking again through old daily prophets to glean any trace of Tom's movements, and worrying over single-serving salads about his next move. In the back of his mind, he knows that he has to begin making a choice, and soon. This time in the last timeline, he was beginning to feel contrary to his parents, embarrassed with how easily everyone dismissed him. He'd started working ridiculously inflated hours, staying late into the night, as if completing a report by morning would win him the respect he so craved. Now, he's on rather better terms with his family, though his parents are not entirely cheerful about the Prowett decision, as his mother calls it icily. Charlie, at least, is something approaching a friend, and Percy's been considerably more kind to Ron and Harry than he'd been originally. Mr. Crouch knows his name, which does negate some of the need to overachieve. If the timeline continued exactly the same way, Percy would preside over the trial attempting to expel Harry. He'd spend the next year working for Fudge and Umbridge, hearing their rhetoric and believing it. He'd become junior assistant to the minister, even when the minister was Pew's, imperiused for evil. He would repent too late to be of any use of all. His proximity to the seat of figurehead power did give Percy a sickening inside look into the Dark Lord's machinations at the cost of his relationship with his family. Should he do it again? Before his first painting lesson, Narcissa invites him over for tea. "I thought you might use this parlor," she says after the house elf formally received Percy at the entrance bode and led him to the small, airy room. "We hardly use it. Your work shan't be disturbed. Mr. Barrington quite likes Malfoy Manor, too." Percy had assumed there was some sort of classroom, or maybe he would go to the teacher's home. He hadn't known he had to provide a location. That throws a slight dent in his plans. He can hardly leave a canvas with Tom Riddle's face in Lucius Malfoy's home. Whose face can he leave, An old classmate? A professor? No, that would be exceedingly odd. A self-portrait, perhaps, but that leaves him feeling a bit vulnerable. Mr. Weasley, is my offer not to your liking? Percy starts. No, no, my apologies, Lady Malfoy, he says awkwardly. He's balanced on a very uncomfortable chair, and he worries that he'll look even more out of place trying to fix his position than maintaining it, frozen and rattled. His palms, despite himself, are clammy. I was just thinking about what I was planning on painting. Narcissa's eyes are grey, like Draco, like Sirius. They're warm, though, and when she smiles they crinkle with genuine lines. Worried you may face judgment. I'm not an excellent artist myself, so I promise I shan't judge your efforts. Percy looks up, but she's smiling, as if they're in on a joke together. A bit, he admits. Given my available options as subjects, I imagine I'll inevitably commit some sort of faux pas when I leave a redhead in your parlor. Doesn't really match the decor, I would imagine. Narcissa laughs, the sound lovely and light. You're rather refreshing, she says. I see why Draco likes you. Percy had not known Draco liked him enough to tell his mother about it. He looks down, feeling a bit warm. Go on, she urges. Tell me the great mystery. Percy's mind is completely blank. He looks around him, absently noting the flowered pattern on the silk chaise, and then, for some inexplicable reason, says, My father. Of everyone to pick, Percy clenches his toes in his shoes in irritation. Oh, how splendid, says Narcissa, her warm, interested expression not flinching. A birthday gift, perhaps. Lucius is turning 41 this year, you know, and Arthur. Percy has to quickly do a mental tally. 45, he says. His father is older than Lucius. He'd always assumed they were in the same year. And neither look a day over 42, Narcissa teases. Sitting here in Narcissa Malfoy's elegantly decorated east parlor, for she later informs him that they have several such rooms, each outfitted for a slightly different purpose, is so peaceful and easy. No wonder Draco is so calm all the time. That calmness was baked into his spine since birth. Percy finds himself relaxing, able to shift into a more comfortable position without making any embarrassing noises. Thank you again for organizing the lessons. She waves her hand as if to dismiss his worries. We've really been quite impressed with you. I know Lucius and Arthur don't get along very well, to say nothing of Draco and Ronald, but I do hope you and I can get past that. If I were to limit my social calendar to people not related to those my husband or my son are feuding with, I'd hardly fill a single weekend. Percy chuckles. How is this beautiful, poised, friendly woman the fearsome Narcissa Black, married to the Dark Lord's right-hand man? How had it been for them during the First War? Maybe then Lucius had still been young. Maybe he and Narcissa escaped notice. In just under 2 years' time, the Dark Lord may be sitting in this very parlor. Percy looks at Narcissa and he wants to warn her, but of course he can't. That would be tremendously foolish, not to mention incredibly premature. But it seems so unfair that in addition to everything else the Dark Lord takes, he takes the beautiful too. Something is on your mind, Mr. Weasley. Percy, please, he says automatically. He opens his mouth, and once again something comes out that he didn't plan. I somehow was thinking of Mr. Crouch. Have you seen him recently? He looks very ill. Narcissa doesn't bat an eye at the non sequitur. She hums in consideration, lifting her mug to her mouth. I will ask Lucius, for I haven't seen Crouch in many years. Ever since his wife and son passed, he's undoubtedly neglected his health. Perhaps his bad habits are simply catching up to him. Percy nods. He doesn't know what it is about the perfect serenity of this room, or the calming presence of Narcissa Malfoy, but he feels as though he has no control over what comes out of his bloody mouth. He takes a firm sip of tea to forestall any other ridiculous comments. I hear you've risen to the occasion admirably, continues Narcissa. Draco tells me you've been managing the tournament rather single-handedly. Not a single death so far, not to mention a fight between schools. Percy gratefully seizes on the new topic. Oh yes, it's been quite the responsibility, he says, nodding. Between the logistics, of course, and the rest of my workload, I feel rather despairing that international cooperation can ever be achieved. But yes, no death so far. I must ask, we've all been wondering, Narcissa says, leaning forward. However did Harry Potter get his name in the goblet? It's a bit of a mystery, actually, reveals Percy. Narcissa's eyes widen, and he continues, gratified. I'm taking over the investigation on that. I think it could maybe even be Dumbledore setting up a test for Potter. Oh yes, that's precisely the type of thing Albus would do. Or a dark wizard, he says before he remembers where he is. Narcissa doesn't seem to take offense. It seems a bit convoluted now, and Moody is there. He's one of the most feared auras. Did you know that he demonstrated the unforgivables in class? Draco was distraught for days. Percy privately doubts this. But Moody demonstrating unforgivables, and Dumbledore allowed it. What possible educational value could that hold for 14-year-old students? Merlin, did he show the first years too? What did he demonstrate on? Rats, spiders. Although if the famous aura Alistair Moody can cast the unforgivables as coolly as he pleases, perhaps it isn't so taboo for Percy to consider practicing the same. His one imperious curse had not left him feeling any worse for wear. Narcissa shakes her head. He's been acting erratically for the past few years. It's sad, isn't it? So many of those in power are getting old, out of touch. We need the new generation, people like you, Percy, to take up the torch and continue to lead us forward. My friend Nymphadora, Percy says, and then abruptly shuts his mouth. Merlin, he should not be thinking of Narcissa as a friend. She is married to Lucius Malfoy. She may not be an enemy yet, but she is not harmless either. This time Narcissa reacts. Her grip tightens on her teacup and she shifts just slightly so that she's closer to Percy. My niece. She's Moody's understudy, I believe, Percy says awkwardly. You two are friends. Yes, Percy says. He grips his own teacup tighter. I went to her mother. I hoped she may help me learn about my heritage. Narcissa says nothing. As Weasleys, we have very little, he continues. He's not even flushing red. They both know this is true. But I do have a heritage through my father and my mother, and Madame Tonks helped me learn it. Andy does know all the gossip, Narcissa says very quietly. Percy looks at her sideways and sees her visibly pull her mask over her face. Percy, what is she like, Nymphadora? She's brilliant, Percy says, hoping desperately that Narcissa isn't searching for negative news. She's very smart and very confident. She's quite skilled at magic, particularly potions and transfiguration. She has a strong sense of humor, though it sometimes can be shocking, and she works incredibly hard but is always cheerful about it. Percy stops. Had that been inappropriate? She sounds like Andromeda, Narcissa says, and it almost sounds wistful. Abruptly, she sits straighter and her face smooths of emotion. Well, Percy, it was very nice to have you over. Please feel free to schedule your sessions with Mr. Barrington at your own convenience. Percy stands, understanding very clearly that he'd overstepped some line. I apologize if I spoke of things better left unspoken. Narcissa meets his eyes, and she is once again warm and lovely and alive. Not unspoken, she says, but they are admittedly surprising. Percy smiles bashfully. Thank you again for letting me use your parlor. She smiles mischievously, and Percy can suddenly see Draco in the curve of her smile. My only request is that you show me your progress periodically. I shan't show Lucius. His tolerance may not extend to a portrait of Arthur in his home, but I've never held a grudge against your father. She reads the question that is clearly on Percy's face and shakes her head chidingly. That is not a story for me to tell. It is not a story I believe you want to hear either. This, of course, piques Percy's curiosity, and he resolves to ask his father the next time that he's home. Asterisk giants, interestingly, organize themselves in groups of approximately 20. One head giant, considered to be somewhat of a king, and then roughly 10 adults and 5 to 10 children. The title of king, or their giantish equivalent, is granted to the giant able to kill the reigning leader and avoid being killed by the rest of the clan. Somehow, and here Percy is glad little is known about giant physiology. Giants can mate with humans and produce offspring. Hagrid, Madame Maxim. While giants are said to be brutish, unintelligent, and violent, their half-human children can incorporate themselves into society. Giants respect displays of power, strength, and valuable gifts. On all fronts, Percy has to reluctantly conclude the dark side, so to speak, has an advantage, but the Ministry could win loyalty if they act quickly. Giants have no real desire to integrate into normal wizarding society. Their greatest desire is to be left alone, plied with fancy goods, to their own savage devices. Werewolves, meanwhile, have a much more complex social structure. They operate according to pack law, a dizzying array of social norms and relationships that even Romulus Rosencrantz, the werewolf scholar, famously allowing himself to be bitten, cannot easily distill. The leader of the pack is important. Werewolves like Lupin, Packless, are weak but more human. Werewolves also have more complex motivations. They are largely human after all. They are driven by pride and greed and anger, like any other human, as well as comfort and respect and gifts. The Ministry has a fighting chance, Percy writes at the end of the memo, underlying the next words, by providing access to supplies, shelter, and wolfsbane. He notices Amos Diggory watching him carefully when Percy comes in during the lunch hour to browse some of the reports compiled by his department. Diggory liaisons more often with the goblins than werewolves or giants, but perhaps he is interested in what Percy is doing for his connection to the Weasley family. Percy leaves quickly after duplicating some of the reports with a tap of his wand. He does not want Diggory to tell Arthur anything that Percy cannot explain. He submits the memo to Crouch, feeling a bit proud of his analysis. If Crouch truly is focusing on besting the Dark Lord, maybe he'll take Percy's recommendations into consideration, as he should, and Percy can finally start enacting real change. It's a bit exciting, to be honest. Despite everything, Percy cannot really find it within him to believe the Ministry is inherently as ineffective of a place as his brothers do. Are good people working here? Good people working to keep the wheels of society turning? Good people following orders? And it is not the fault of the organization when those orders turn toward harm. Percy has taken to apparating directly from his living room into the Ministry lobby as to avoid the chill. Crouch begins to work the kinds of hours that Percy remembered from the previous timeline, disappearing into his office and only emerging to shout hoarsely at Percy or Liam to fetch him meals and tea. Whatever he's doing involves a tremendous amount of writing. Percy knocks with a tray one day in mid-November and sees Crouch with a veritable mountain of crumpled parchment on his desk, covered in his thin, dark handwriting. "What do you think of Dumbledore?" Crouch says abruptly, sweeping a great pile of scratching to the ground. "Sir?" Percy asks cautiously. It feels like everything he does around Crouch is cautious. He does not remember Crouch being so brittle last time, though Percy admittedly had been equally cautious, more out of nerves than anything else. "Do you think he's a strong leader, capable?" "He's certainly capable," Percy equivocates. He has gotten the impression Crouch doesn't particularly like Dumbledore, but it is not exactly political to openly disparage the great Albus Dumbledore. Crouch waves his quill irritably. "But if something were to happen, if there was an emergency, would you trust him?" "No," thinks Percy. He hears an echo of Tom's cry of rage, remembers the way his face had twisted with Tom's disgust as they faced the shadow of Dumbledore produced by the diadem. "I suppose," says Percy. "May I ask why you ask, sir?" Crouch gives him a look. Percy takes that as a no and backs out hastily. Maybe Crouch is trying for Dumbledore's job, or at least part of the small but occasionally vocal minority, led by one Lucius Malfoy, to have him ousted. This reminds Percy of Lucius' invitation, but he hasn't quite worked up the courage to meet him in his own stomping grounds. Tonks doesn't think so. She thinks that Crouch knows something about the darkness that's begun to spring up around the country, small groups of teenagers causing havoc, pairs of men in cloaks sowing dissent. She only knows because she managed to get herself assigned to Scrimgeour in the absence of Moody, and Scrimgeour is convinced that some kind of trouble is brewing. "Moody confirmed his identity," Tonks says sadly, passing him in the hallway. "I tested him with nearly 10 different passwords, and he got them all." Tonks has also found some information about Bertha Jorkins. No family in Albania, no family at all, really. She'd announced one day her intentions to visit Albania without naming any specifics like what city she was visiting or how long she would be gone. "You should ask Charlie." "Charlie? Romania, Albania. What's the difference?" I'm sure he'd be up for a bit of sleuthing. Percy even lunches with Landon one day, though his friend's days off are extremely limited, owing to the rigorous schedule of being an unspeakable. Landon has a harried, anxious look, his face a bit grey, and he spends the entire lunch period glancing at his watch. The unspeakable track is notoriously difficult, he informs Percy, and he will not wash out before the end of the training period. Finally, he can't avoid going to Gringotts, and correspondingly, seeing Bill much longer. He needs more money, and he does want to discreetly inquire whether one Tom M. Riddle had a Gringotts vault. The first goal he succeeds at after a very lengthy and exhausting argument with his chief account manager, who tries to convince Percy that the fee they're charging to convert gold to galleons is perfectly reasonable. While in theory Percy has unlimited money, in theory, since he does not have the resources to recreate the elixir of gold without access to a potions lab, and he's not quite ready to tell Snape about his theft all those years ago, the miserly part of him refuses on principle to accept an inflated charge. The second goal he fails at completely. His account manager, somewhat jovial after their protracted and nasty fight, wherein Percy gained an improvement of only a few sickles, closes down instantly. "We do not share our customers' secrets," is all Percy can get out of him. And so Percy is already in a black mood when he goes to the employee break room to see Bill. Bill looks wonderful, of course, strong, tall, and still improbably tanned in November. He insists on making Percy a cup of tea and feeding him a biscuit like he's some sort of male Marley Weasley, and even gives Percy a very strong hug. "Good to see you too," Percy says, massaging his lower back. "Merlin, he really needs to exercise." "So great to be back in England," Bill says enthusiastically. "The snow, I've not seen snow for years, Percy." "It's not even snowing yet," Percy can't help but point out. Bill refuses to be cowed. "But there's the suggestion of snow. In Cairo, we didn't even have that, only the omnipresent reality of sand." Bill clearly intends this to be funny. Percy only has it in him to smile weakly. "So, Percy, what are you here for? Opened your own Gringotts vault, and right after graduation, too. I've been keeping my meager earnings in a dragon skin bag." "Yes, I opened a vault as soon as I turned 17, actually," Percy says. "I was just withdrawing some money from it." "And how are your expenses? Manageable?" "You never did tell me where you decided to live at the end of the day." "Not the borough, I hear. Mum was rather tossed off." "Quite manageable, thank you," Percy says stiffly. He doesn't have any friends, after all. He saves loads by going directly home after work and cooking various combinations of vegetables and chicken. "I've a small flat in London. Barely a flat, really. More like a closet with a bed." Percy doesn't actually know where Bill is living. He has hordes of friends all over the country. He could probably hop from couch to couch for a year and not run out of people willing to put him up at their own expense. He doesn't want to join the list. "Good for you," Bill says approvingly. There's a bit of an awkward silence. "And you're going to Hogwarts, I hear. Checking in on the tournament. It's a lot of responsibility, I'd imagine." There once was a time where Percy and Bill didn't talk to each other like an awkward uncle and a more awkward nephew, but Percy can barely remember it. "Not too much," he says noncommittally. He keeps hesitating, unsure whether he can ask Bill the question that's on his mind. He can't ask Bill, though. What's Bill going to do? Open the vault for him? Percy is reasonably sure Tom opened a vault at Gringotts, but that knowledge hardly helps him. He needs to focus on goals that are attainable. Goals like finding the ancestral Gaunt home or tracking down a Muggle orphanage. Gringotts is like a prison. He's never going to get inside, not even with Bill's help. And so he requests to meet with Tobias Greengrass. Tobias agrees, amused, and for the third time in Percy's life, he finds himself at a single blade for tea with a pureblood prince. This time he only orders tea, Earl Grey, 1 slice of lemon. Tobias orders a whiskey neat, even though it is just past 10 in the morning on a Saturday. Percy looks down at his tea when it arrives. There's got to be some sort of rule book about this. "There's no big secret," Tobias says with unerring accuracy into the particulars of Percy's private thoughts. "Well, maybe one. Whatever you order, do so with supreme confidence, as if the other person's choice is simply unthinkable. Observe." He winks at Percy, and then his face changes, smoothing out. He eyes Percy's tea, making it somehow excruciatingly obvious in the set of his eyebrows, and the lift in his chin that ordering tea was plebeian, and ordering Earl Grey was nothing short than obscene. The sliver of lemon, added in an attempt to be cultured, merely makes the entire thing more pathetic, or so says the slight flaring of his nostrils. Percy is deeply impressed, and more than a bit envious, and a bit ticked off. Tobias grins easily, and the expression slides off his face like water. "You've got to work on keeping your thoughts to yourself," he advises, taking a sip of his drink. "Your face is far too expressive by half." Percy nods. Mirror practice he schedules for later in the day. Now, tell me about what you're up to these days. I never hear anything from Landon. He's disappeared into the belly of the beast, and he shan't return for anything less than an order of Merlin. Percy laughs, surprised at the easy intimacy that Tobias creates, simply on the back of their shared acquaintance and the 1 week Percy spent in his house. Well, I've also disappeared into a belly of a beast, though one less ferocious than the unspeakable department, he says, and if he feels himself trying to be clever, he doesn't stop himself. I'm assisting Mr. Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Tobias raises an eyebrow and raises his glass slightly in salute. Lade, I assume you knew of the tournament before making your choice. Percy is about to say no, of course not, but then he tries to look secretive and just a big smug. I can neither confirm nor deny. He continues, it is fairly interesting due to the tournament. Crouch tasks me to visit Hogwarts periodically, keep an eye on things. We're betting on some sort of international incident, though likely of the teenaged sort. Tobias chuckles appreciatively. I'm surprised none yet have happened. That we know of, says Percy mock darkly. It's surprisingly easy to talk to Tobias like this, as if they are two equals, sitting opposite tea and whiskey in a cultured and expensive cafe. And if I may get to the point, may I ask why you wanted to meet? Tobias continues to smile to take the bite out of his words. I'm always pleased to mentor a promising young man like yourself, but if I may posit my impression of you, I believe you are unlikely to contact me without a specific reason. Percy flushes slightly, mostly heat around his neck that he hopes doesn't creep onto his face. Well, I do not know if you recall, but Landon and I were researching the Founder's artifacts. How could I forget? Landon was quite saddened that you never found even a whisper of a diadem or a locket or whatever else you two were convinced you'd find in Hogwarts. We gave up on any artifacts themselves years ago, Percy says, not inaccurately. But I kept researching the Founders themselves. Find history very interesting, you see. Quite. Percy hesitates and then plunges forward. I found that the Hufflepuff line allegedly ended with Heidi Hufflepuff's marriage into the Smith family. The Slytherins, meanwhile, have no other descendants than the Gaunt family. You are quite the researcher, Percy, Tobias says. Something in his eyes have sharpened. Percy can tell that whatever he just said has interested Tobias. The other man leans forward slightly. Not many have found those connections. I met with Horatio Smith, he continues, not sure precisely how to respond to that. He didn't have much to tell me, but I don't believe any Gaunts are left. I don't believe so either. Something about the carefully studied way that he says this makes Percy suddenly certain that Tobias Greengrass knows precisely who Tom Riddle is. He decides to finish what he started. Well, I was hoping to find the Gaunts' ancestral home. If it's not protected by wards, I thought I might investigate. Tobias evaluates Percy for several long, silent seconds. Then he says, Percy, I say this to you as someone with a vested interest in seeing what you may accomplish one day. I do not believe you should pursue this line of inquiry any further. Sir, I think you know some of what I know, Tobias says very quietly. And if you do know what I know, then you will stay away from the Gaunts and any of their descendants that may be still alive. And if they are still alive, Percy dares. Tobias breathes, his eyes intent. Then I would keep my head down and hope they do not notice me. Have they noticed you, sir? Tobias' eyes darken, and he no longer looks like the friendly father of one of Percy's school friends. They tried once, and I hope to Merlin they do not again. Well, that answers precisely as many questions as it raises. Tobias finishes the rest of his whiskey and stands. Do not do anything stupid or hasty, he counsels. I will look into what we spoke of, and keep in mind what we both think to be true. Percy watches him leave with quick, sure steps, not entirely what he just agreed to, nor what he just told Tobias. Hi, Percy and Tonks. Dee and I went to Albania last weekend. Tonks, it's not the same country, not at all. Nice for a visit, though. I asked around discreetly in Tirana, but it's harder than I thought to track down an errant witch. I tried asking at some inns, but they all looked at me strangely. There are some whispers here, though, of a vampire in the forest. One bartender told me that the vampire is thought to have been defeated in August, just about when Bertha disappeared, but besides that I'm not sure if there's any connection. Don't think my talents really lie in espionage, to be honest. Also, keep it quiet, you two, but I'll be back just in time for the first task at Hogwarts. Shall we all go for a pint? Charlie, the problem that Percy is facing in his research is that theoretically the difference between one's soul and one's magic makes sense. Similarly, it seems obvious that people have minds even if they do not have magic. Muggles are capable of thought, but to separate them in any meaningful way, at least in a legal way, seems impossible. Thus, even if Percy were to create a spell to track souls or minds, rather than magic or blood, there would be no way for him to test it on anything other than the Horcrux. Point me, Tom Riddle points to the diadem. Point me, Lady Ravenclaw does not, though Percy is not familiar with Ravenclaw's magical signature, and so he had not really expected the spell to work. At least that implies to him that Tom's magical signature does not change, even within his different Horcruxes. That seems like a breakthrough, but he struggles to verbalize what it might actually mean for their question. At this point, he is considering whether he or Snape should just make a bloody Horcrux so at least they could study how it works. He spends every bit of free time that he has working on the portrait. Tom would know. Whether Tom would tell him is another question, but he would rather wrangle with Tom than make a Horcrux himself. Although it would be useful to have a Horcrux, wouldn't it? At the very least, he would not have to worry he would die. November 24 dawns bright and blustery. Percy makes it to Hogwarts just past 9. Charlie arrived over the weekend, but Percy has been swamped with the seemingly interminable forms required to authorize the shipment of 4 dragons from Romania to Scotland and back. He'd forgotten how much paperwork he and Liam had to do for this damned tournament. When Percy goes to visit Snape, he finds the man in a black mood. "Sir," Percy hesitantly says when it becomes clear that Snape wants to mutter angrily to himself instead of acknowledging his presence. "Have you anything to report?" Snape snarls, turning on Percy. "No, sir." "Then leave my sight this instant." Percy flees. He goes to visit his family instead. Harry is sitting with Hermione, staring at a piece of toast. Harry looks so nervous that he may faint where he stands. Poor boy, even at 18, he's short for his age. At 14, Harry looks particularly small. "You'll be completely fine," Percy says with the assurance of the future. He hadn't been there, but he'd later heard of the superior flying Harry exhibited that day. "Play to your strengths." "Moody said that," Harry says absently. Hermione clears her throat, and Harry takes an unwilling bite from the toast he's holding limply in his hand. "Where's Ron?" Harry's expression abruptly turns black. "He's upset at me," he mumbles. Percy rolls his eyes. "He's just jealous," he tells Harry, this time secure in his understanding of Ronald Weasley. "He'll get over it once he realizes how assuredly unlucky you would be to be chosen for this tournament." Harry looks up. "You think I'm unlucky for this?" "Yes," Percy says cautiously. "Don't you?" "Merlin, yes." Harry takes another bite of his toast, this time unprompted. "If I don't have it under control," he says, looking up with something like desperation, "are they going to let me die?" Hermione inhales sharply, but Percy doesn't have to think too hard about this. "Dumbledore absolutely will not let you die," Percy says, meeting Harry's eyes. Harry at least would be assured of his safety in the tournament, though Percy cannot say the same for the other contestants. As usual, when he thinks about Cedric, his stomach lurches and he forces his mind away from the thought. He tries for a joke to distract both him and Harry. "And neither will I, you'll get me fired." "Percy." "Do you know what the first task is?" Harry asks, ignoring the joke. Percy hesitates and then nods. "Yes, and I know that Charlie's here," he says, lowering his voice. "Trust me, they know how to do their job. You may get a bit singed, but they know how to subdue they know how to prevent people from dying at this sort of thing, even 14-year-old boys." Harry nods, not looking any more convinced. Percy lingers awkwardly for a few seconds and then goes to seek out Ron. Fat Lady lets him inside the common room when he flashes his ministry badge after only a bit of teasing about how tall he's grown since he graduated. Ron is alone in the 4th year's boys' dorm. Percy knocks on the door frame and then invites himself in. "Why are you always here?" Ron groans when he looks up to see Percy. "I just ditched Fred and George. They seem to think I should go and wish Harry luck." "Well, you probably should go and wish Harry luck," Percy says delicately. Ron glowers. "He doesn't need me," he says grumpily. "He has Hermione and the whole bleeding house and 1,000 galleons." Percy leans against the door. Ron, in the grand tradition of siblings everywhere, has reverted to a childhood whine when faced with his older brother. "Ron, do you know how many friends I had in Hogwarts?" Ron's expression seems to suggest that he has no interest in answering this question. "One." Percy says firmly. And we never talk now because he's so busy with work. Don't throw away your best friends because you're jealous. I'm not jealous. Being Harry is not a blessing, says Percy. He needs you, Ron. Someone is likely trying to kill him with this scheme. Ron sighs. Percy knows Ron knows what he's saying is true, but he also knows he isn't going to admit it now. With nothing else to do, he visits Myrtle. His trips to Hogwarts are much less productive than he'd once thought. She's spinning around in her bathroom, excited for the first task. Dragons, Percy. I'm going to go. I never watch those nasty Quidditch games, but I can't miss dragons. Do you think any of the champions will die? Should I introduce myself? I hope it's not that French girl. She seems rather uppity, but Cedric could share my bathroom any day. And Harry, of course. None of them will die, Myrtle, he says tiredly before he freezes. Well, one of them will die. I hate this bloody year. You should have stayed here, Myrtle says tartly. You could have kept your lessons going. I don't have any time at the ministry, and when I do have time, I don't even know what I should be studying, Percy complains. More research on souls, what's the bloody use? Potions, Myrtle suggests, making a slow loop. I can't brew potions in my flat. You could paint. I still get compliments on the portrait you did of me. Myrtle turns so she's facing him. Percy, do you think if you dug up my grave you could make me a real portrait? Percy splutters. I'm sorry. Don't you just need a sample of me? I can tell you where I'm buried. Then I'd have someone to talk to. It's an interesting question. Can one be a ghost and a portrait, which would be the more representative self? The recipe I saw wasn't clear, Percy says, happy to be distracted from his own misery. When I first read it, I thought all you needed was blood or bone, but I'm not so sure now. I think you'd need something from the person while they were alive. Myrtle considers this. If you used me, I'm a ghost, I'm alive, sort of. I could dive into the potion. I'm pretty sure that would kill you, Myrtle, again. She shrugs. Seems like a win-win. I'd be free, but part of me would be left behind. Percy thinks about it. Well, I suppose why couldn't you do the potion with a ghost? We've established the portraits don't have souls, not really. But I'm not sure you would have the same resonant properties as blood. My portrait might not remember everything that I do, you mean? Percy nods absently. It's a thorny puzzle, the kind of thing he may bring up with McGonagall the next time he meets with her. Then even if you do pass on, there'll always be a version of you by this bathroom, waiting to talk to someone too sad to face the rest of the castle. I'd like that, Myrtle says dreamily. A legacy. We're going to leave a legacy anyway, Myrtle, Percy says, if all goes according to plan. Myrtle turns in the air to face him again, her eyes narrowed from behind her round-rimmed glasses. You can't give up hope, Percy. I'm sorry. I know you, she says, and Percy has to look away from the blunt force of her ghostly eyes. If you stop believing in yourself, you'll stop trying. It's like the Patronus. Percy's face sours. It is true that he hasn't tried to summon a Patronus in many months. But I haven't given up on the Patronus, Myrtle. I've been busy. Do you know how many things I've on my plate? You managed to get first in your year at Hogwarts, find 2 Horcruxes, and destroy one, Myrtle points out coolly. I don't believe your job is busier than that. Something is making you lose hope, Percy. What is it? Percy exhales through his nose and adjusts his glasses with one hand. Nothing's making me lose hope, Myrtle. We've barely had any hope at all this whole time. Is it because of Tom? No, it's not because of Tom, snaps Percy, spurred into irritation by yet another accusation that he is missing Tom, the precursor to the most feared wizard of their time. Look around you, Myrtle. Everything is proceeding exactly on schedule. It's as if nothing's changed. What has even been the point of it all if a 17-year-old is still going to die at the end of the year? And nobody will believe Harry when the Dark Lord returns. And my family will still hate me. And we have no bloody idea where to find the next Horcrux. Myrtle watches him silently as he stops, his chest heaving despite himself, and a burn in the back of his throat that matches the flush around his neck and shoulders. He hadn't quite realized until he said it aloud how useless he's been feeling, how pointless it all feels if everything is just going to happen exactly the same way. At the risk of pointing out the obvious, says Myrtle into the quiet creaking of the bathroom, you want it to remain the same, at least for now. I suppose I want the important parts to stay the same, but everything else to change, Percy mumbles to his feet, both to admit it to himself and to Myrtle. Myrtle perches on the edge of one of the sinks, the pipes groaning as if she had settled real weight upon the basin. Snape's been researching the potion, you know. I think he's trying to see if Cedric can be saved. I doubt that, Percy says tiredly. Snape will be the first to say that Cedric's death is a regrettable sacrifice. Well, that's why he's researching it, I'd imagine, Myrtle points out pertly, to see if Cedric needs to be sacrificed or not. Better than assuming the worst, no. Percy tries not to let on how surprised he is by this news. What are you trying to say, then? I'm saying that you either assume nothing can change or everything could change, says Myrtle, but you're avoiding doing the necessary research because you're scared to know the answer. I'm not, aren't you? For a second, Percy waits for irritation to lick up his sides. When he realizes it's not coming, he chuckles despite himself, shaking his head. You're a very annoying friend, he informs Myrtle, raising his head to meet her impish grin with a weak smile of his own. I'm wise beyond my years, she says loftily, twirling one of her pigtails around her index finger. And you're not the first wizard to complain to me while missing the obvious. Maybe I won't banish you, Percy says, feeling inexplicably lightened. I'm not sure Hogwarts will be able to get on without your insight. Myrtle lowers her finger, and her pigtail drops slowly to brush against her shoulder. I've thought about it, she admits quietly. I don't really know what I want, Percy. Well, you can't go anywhere until we're done with this, one way or another, he says, hitching his bag higher on his shoulder. Thanks, Myrtle. I'm going to speak to Snape after the task. He snapped at me when I came by earlier. He's having a difficult year, I think, Myrtle says, hopping off the sink to float next to him as they exit the bathroom. He really hates Mad-Eye Moody. I can sort of understand it, to be honest. I've been sitting in on Moody's classes, and he really hates dark wizards. I think he had some sort of tragic backstory, though none of the ghosts know what it is. He spends most of the time glaring at Snape, who spends most of his time glaring at him back. None of the students had known very much about Snape's dark background, or at least Percy had certainly never heard anything other than rumors when he had been a student. But he supposes that the adult wizards would have been very much aware of Snape's connections to the Dark Lord. Some of them may have been at Snape's trial, or shocked when Dumbledore personally vouched for Snape. Percy had never really considered what it would be like to be Snape, but perhaps that was the reason why Snape consented to work at Hogwarts, year after year. Percy can't imagine it is very pleasant for Snape to interact with the general public or anyone in the ministry. Percy remembers what it felt like in those days after the war, how so many of his colleagues had been treated like pariahs, and he had been treated like a criminal. There was the light side and the dark side, and if the court of society judged that someone was not part of the light side, they were automatically relegated to the dark side. Percy had been hissed at in the streets and denied service at Gladrags, all for the crime of believing that what the minister of magic said was true or being too afraid to defy the ministry. As if the average wizard hadn't done the same. As if the average wizard hadn't complied with the Death Eaters every day, afraid of attracting attention and being labeled a sympathizer. At the time, Percy had been so racked with guilt that he'd felt his ostracism justified, and had even contributed to it by spending the majority of the time alone in his flat. He would have lost his job if Kingsley hadn't personally argued in his favor. Percy imagines facing that type of derision for 20 years and shudders. No wonder Snape is in such a foul temper all of the time. Percy can't really blame him. Harry looks so small down there, facing off the dragon with nary but his wand. He manages to complete an impressive Accio, however. Hermione sighs in relief in the aisle in front of Percy, and then transforms the moment he's on his broom. In the air, he is equally small but much more assured and confident, dodging dragon fire as if it were merely a bludger. Ron says, his face pale, when Harry has to execute a particularly nasty maneuver to dodge a burst of flame. Ginny is watching through her fingers, and Percy has to resist the urge to do the same. He sees Charlie shifting by the side of the arena, ready with his wand, but if Harry veers into the wrong burst of flame, nothing that Charlie or any of the other trainers could do would really help. Someone really is trying to kill him, aren't they? Honestly, Hermione says, with an exaggerated sigh. You are impossible, Ronald. Ron and Hermione rush to the tent after the task ends. Percy stays with the mild hope that he'll be asked to help deliberate the scores, but alas, he remains in the stands, alone. He wonders how Crumb feels, seeing a 14-year boy fly like that. What must it be like to have your entire identity built upon one skill, only to see another match or even surpass your talents? When he visits Snape after the task, Percy cannot tell if the other man has been cheered or disappointed by Harry's inspired performance in the arena. Snape allows him entry into his office without snapping at him so harshly, which Percy takes cautiously as a positive sign, but then glowers disapprovingly over his large, hooked nose at Percy, which is definitively far more of a negative sign. Percy soldiers forward, cutting straight to the chase. Myrtle told me that you may know what potion the Dark Lord is going to use. Snape's change twists in annoyance, though his nose features prominently in this expression as well. It would save us all some time if we three merely spoke together, but I fear that would deprive the ghost of her only joy in her afterlife. Myrtle will have to be dead, truly banished, before she stops gossiping, Percy agrees. With Myrtle in mind, he says bluntly, rather than equivocating around the topic, but if you had a hint as to what potion will be used, why would you not tell me? Snape looks faintly taken aback by Percy's forthrightness, or perhaps his lack of subtlety. Percy has come to realize that while he is rather good at being mysterious, particularly after the success of a few sessions in front of the mirror, he is not particularly subtle. Rather, he seems to be so uninteresting to the general public that if he merely keeps his mouth shut, nobody thinks to wonder what he may be up to. A benefit of having few friends, he supposes. The ghost must have failed to impress upon you that I have merely a guess. Percy resists the urge to roll his eyes. Has he not been entirely truthful with Snape? More or less. He does not know why Snape feels the urge to dance around sensitive topics, but he does not enjoy being on the reciprocating side. Well, what is the guess? Have you any familiarity with the summer solstice rituals? Percy blinks at Snape, taken aback from the question. He thinks first of Aunt Muriel, clad in her light green robes, standing before a crashing blue sea, clutching a rabbit. A bit. The light rituals, I suppose. Snape raises an eyebrow infinitesimally. I was not aware that the Weasley family observed the old ways. My Aunt Muriel does, Percy explains defensively. What do you practice? Percy describes the ritual, capturing the rabbit under the light of the sun, presenting it at sunrise, asking for a wish. Interesting, remarks Snape when Percy is finished. The most common dark ritual is similar, though with some obvious inversions. Each individual must procure their own animal sacrifice under the full moon, rather than the full sun, and while you may ask for a wish, you do not do so aloud. So are you implying that the Dark Lord uses a ritual to return? I believe he will corrupt a more complex version of a dark summer solstice ritual, confirms Snape in a low voice. You are sure that Pettigrew sacrifices his flesh and that the events occur in a graveyard? Percy nods. As far as I am aware. There is a very old potion that we refer to today merely as the blood and bone potion. Snape hesitates and then turns to the shelves behind him, sliding a recipe out of a book of scrolls and handing it to Percy. Percy scans it and blanches. Yes. It requires, as you can see, flesh of a servant, blood of an enemy, bone of a father, a triad of powerful ingredients, and 3 types of sacrifices to lend the potion thrice the power. But this potion does not seem tied to the summer solstice, says Percy, wrinkling his nose despite himself as he reads the gruesome list of ingredients. It does not confer a wish either, points out Snape, but rather is used to bring someone back from the very brink of death if they are ill. I cannot be certain, of course, but I know how the Dark Lord thinks, and I believe it likely he will use this potion in conjunction with a summer solstice ritual to wish himself back to body. Percy purses his lips, still looking at the recipe, written out in Snape's spiky handwriting that he recognizes instantly after 14 years of deciphering his instructions on the board. So do they use Cedric as a sacrifice? When Snape does not immediately reply, Percy glances up, feeling an instinctive ball of worry form in his stomach. Snape's face is closed off and forbidding, and Percy has to fight the urge to apologize for his question. What? Snape seems to choose his words carefully. I do not believe the Dark Lord needs a sacrifice beyond what the potion requires. Percy's instinctive flutter of relief is tempered by the scowl still marring Snape's features. So Cedric need not go with Harry. We do not know, emphasizes Snape. Percy closes his eyes briefly. He knows what Snape is implying. They do not know that the Dark Lord will use the blood and bone potion. They do not know that Cedric need not be sacrificed. They do not know anything. They are nothing more than blind explorers without the use of magic, fumbling around in the dark without so much as a seeing eye spell for mercy. So we need to let him go along with Harry, says Percy dully, his hand falling to his side. He resists the urge to crumple the parchment up viciously. The brief elation he'd felt after his conversation with Myrtle, and the soaring feeling in his stomach, watching Harry twist his way victoriously out of a line of dragon fire, grumbles and subsides, leaving him with the all-too-familiar resignation. "We will not interfere with the tournament," confirms Snape, his voice like shards of slivered glass. "But how can we even be sure Cedric will be the sacrifice?" Percy snaps back heatedly, feeling sliced raw by the thought. "If anything changes, he won't be with Harry in the maze. Shall we imperious him ourselves, lead him to his slaughter like a rabbit?" Snape does not respond to his outburst, instead holding out a hand for the recipe that Percy still grips tightly in one hand. "In truth, I have a hard time believing the Dark Lord will rely on an innocent. It is as you say, there is no confirmation that Potter will even win the tournament, let alone bring with him an extra contestant. But we cannot be sure. Not at present." A second later, more gently, "Percy, I will continue searching. If I can find a way to communicate with Pettigrew, we may be able to tell with more confidence. I do not enjoy the thought that we may sacrifice an innocent due only to our own ignorance." "My ignorance," says Percy bitterly. "If I had just bothered to think this all through, if I had just spoken to Harry, understood more about the potion." "You could not discern all of the timeline's mysteries," snaps Snape, and though his tone is harsh, the words are oddly reassuring. Percy looks up to meet the other man's dark, unfathomable gaze. "Even had you kidnapped Potter and forced him to write an account of everything that had occurred, you would have missed something, and we would at one point or another feel constrained by our lack of knowledge. We will proceed with what we know, and we will strive to learn what we can. Is that understood?" Percy swallows around an uncomfortable edge in his throat and nods mutely. "To Harry," Tonks cheers 3 hours later, holding up her tankard of regular, non-buttery beer. Percy has a gin fizz. Madame Rosmutter had only given him the slightest bit of teasing over his age when he'd ordered it, but she does that to all Hogwarts graduates, so he doesn't take it personally. "To Harry," echo the Weasley brothers. Bill is there too, but Percy is trying not to let his older, younger, in a way, brother bother him. His stomach is still unsettled from his earlier conversation with Snape, and the alcohol in his drink is not helping him calm down. "He's small, but he is mighty," Charlie says, setting down his own tankard. "Did you see that flying? He should go for England." Bill nods emphatically. "I think he's even better than you, Charlie." Charlie takes it without hurt pride. That's one thing Percy has always liked about Charlie, very little ego. "Oliver loved that kid," he says, grinning. "Wrote to me about him every year. Harry's unbelievable." Percy grins too, despite himself. "He did love Harry," he contributes. "Used to recite his stats in the bathroom. Hopefully Oliver can play professionally one day." Charlie wipes his mouth and then raises his glass again. "To our ministry employees, of course." "Cheerio," Tonks says, clinking her glass with his. "You could come too, Charles. Join Percival and I at luncheon." Charlie shakes his head, holding up his glass as if to ward off her attack. "I'm still happy with the dragons, thank you." There's a moment where both Tonks and Percy want to ask about Daniel. They catch each other's eye and quickly turn instead to Bill, who is eyeing them a bit bemusedly and sipping his fire whiskey, the glass steaming. "And you, Bill, how's Gringotts?" "The goblins are antsy," Bill says, frowning. "They've heard something. Rumors, I think, though they won't share exactly what. Amos is spending more time at Gringotts than his own house these days." Tonks nods, the mood darkening. "Same with the auras. Nobody wants to say Death Eaters, but we're afraid someone's trying to round them up again, start back the old parade." Percy sits very quietly, his mouth dry. "What, like you know who?" Charlie asks incredulously. Tonks shakes her head. "Not hardly," she says, "but there's always the risk of a copycat. I mean, he disappeared at the peak of his power. Half of his cronies are big shots in the ministry now. I've gone over their trials. I bet Crouch has a lot to say on the topic." "Crouch. You know, because of his son." At Percy's quizzical look, Tonks elaborates. "His son was one of the people charged with torturing the Longbottoms, life in Azkaban. Crouch sentenced him himself. Said he had no son anymore, that justice had to be served." Bill lets out a low whistle, taking a gulp of his drink. Seems like Crouch would be the last person to say anything about Death Eaters. True, Tonks concedes, but he hates Death Eaters. If he sent his own son to die, and he did die, within the year, I think. Imagine what he'll do if there are copycats now. Percy had never known this, not in either timeline. He reapplies the cooling charm on his glass absently while he thinks about it. Maybe that was why Crouch was acting so strangely. Imagine sentencing one's own child to Azkaban, and knowing that child helped to torture a young couple to insanity. Seeing signs of the Death Eaters returning would definitely trigger some odd behavior. Well, the news of Death Eaters hasn't reached Romania yet, Charlie offers. Although, like I said, in Albania they were speaking of a vampire. Seems like a lot of the creatures are on the move, which I suppose doesn't bode well for anyone. Definitely related to the Dark Lord, in whatever form he's in. Although Percy honestly would not put it past him to possess an actual vampire. Had he missed this all the first time? Noticing the signs, watching as those inside the ministry began preparing, he thought the entire country was oblivious until that day when the Dark Lord attacked the Hall of Prophecy. He'd been so stubborn, so insistent, precisely because he believed what everyone else had believed. But if he just opened his eyes a bit more, he could have seen the truth earlier. Percy sighs heavily. You all right, Perce? Oh, yes, it's just a lot sometimes. Bill nods. His eyes have no business being that warm or his smile so understanding. It really is, he agrees softly. Then a smirk. Did I tell you lot that goblins are terrible gossips? You should hear what they've told me about Bagman. I bet Crouch hates Bagman too, says Tonks, taking an effusive sip of her beer. He must be having a rough go of it, Crouch. Crouch tried to lock away Bagman too. Apparently Bagman's uncle or godfather or something was Rookwood, and Bagman idiotically passed him secrets in the First War. At least, that was what Crouch alleged. Bagman got off by saying he had no idea that Rookwood was a Death Eater. Percy blinks, absorbing this new information. He hadn't thought to look into Crouch's life, largely because Crouch is such a plain, inscrutable man, but he supposes he really ought to do better diligence if he's to solve the mystery of whatever is killing, or driving, the man. Well, I doubt Bagman's a Death Eater, Percy says skeptically, thinking of the large, jovial, bumbling man. I think he's just always out for his own skin. Rookwood probably paid him for the secrets. Crouch does hate him, though. He's always glaring at him whenever they have to cross paths. Well, maybe he's doing the same thing again, Bill breaks in. Bagman owes the goblins serious money, apparently. Too much gambling, I think. The goblins don't look very kindly to people who do not repay their debts. Percy hadn't really considered that there might have been a spy in the ministry. He'd always assumed that the Dark Lord heard of the Triwizard Tournament and Harry's involvement in it, through the papers, since Rita Skeeter is covering the event at every opportunity, and then hatched a plan to interfere. It would not be particularly difficult to send Pettigrew or another Death Eater into Hogwarts to meddle with the cup. In theory, all of the visitors to Hogwarts are carefully pre-approved, but in practice, there are so many workers from various ministry departments and the like milling around at these events that someone could slip in unsupervised. But perhaps Bagman was more directly involved. After all, he's all but organizing the whole tournament, and he has Death Eater connections and motive. Percy would not fancy being beholden to the goblins for anything. After the drinks, Bill apparats away, claiming an early morning at the bank, and Charlie hurries off to check on the dragons, leaving Tonks and Percy to make their chilly way to Hogwarts, where McGonagall had promised them use of her flu. Percy could, of course, apparate back as well, but the Madame Tonks has judged it foolish to leave her home unwarded against apparition, and so Tonks always has to find a way to flew home instead. Percy is older than her in a way. He can hardly allow her to walk back alone, even if she is a perfectly competent witch. Molly Weasley, at the very least, did not raise her middle son to be churlish, unlike the rest of them. You know a bit about mind magic, don't you? Tonks asks him, uncharacteristically hesitant, as they walk down the blustery path toward the warm lights of the castle. A bit, says Percy cautiously. I doubt I know more than you. Do you know anything about Dementors? Besides the obvious, Percy tries to think why Tonks may be asking him about the Dementors, but draws a blank. Something in her aura training, perhaps. Auras do have to spend quite a lot of time around the beasts. Not much. I think that's more a branch of soul magic rather than mind magic, though. Why do you ask? Tonks tries to keep her voice light, but it wavers right at the end when she asks, do you think it's possible to recover from repeated exposure to their presence? Are you concerned about having to escort prisoners to Azkaban? You really oughtn't worry. You need far more repeated exposure to Dementors to worry about it affecting you in a meaningful way. So what would it do if you encountered them for years? At this, Percy has to squint at her, alerted by the edge in her voice. Well, we don't really know about repeated, long-term exposure to Dementors, to be honest, he says, trying to watch her reaction carefully without turning his whole body to face hers. Most long-term Azkaban prisoners go mad, eventually. Tonks stumbles over a large branch in their path, but brushes aside Percy's belated attempt to help her over it. But you said it was not mind magic, but soul magic. Well, maybe they do not go mad in the mind, but rather it affects the integrity of their soul, Percy says, this time thoughtfully. It's an interesting point, but there's such a dearth of literature on the topic that he isn't even sure whether it is true that Azkaban prisoners go mad. Tonks, why are you asking? Tonks inhales sharply and then says, her voice low and her hair darkening to a deep black, did Ron ever tell you about my cousin? Oh, Percy swallows around a suddenly dry throat as he remembers that Sirius Black is indeed Tonks' cousin, as well as Draco's, and of course Tonks must know by now that he is innocent. Perhaps she even sees him regularly at the Black family house. Likely how she meets Remus. Has she already fallen in love with the older man, or will it take longer? He shakes his head to steady himself. What he needs to focus on is the implication that Tonks is involved enough with the drama to know that Black is innocent. Is she in the Order already, or is this an issue of family rather than loyalty to a cause? When he looks again to his right, he sees that Tonks is holding her wand tightly. It hurts him a little that she would assume he was a threat, or that she would automatically take Black's side over Percy's. His voice is sharp when he responds. He could be dangerous, Tonks. So you don't know? No, I know the whole story, more of it than you likely think I do, Percy snaps back, irritated. But Tonks, we don't know how repeated long-term Dementor exposure affects his brain, or his magic, or his soul. Be careful. Tonks sighs and relaxes her grip on her wand, turning back to face the path. They begin the climb toward the gates of the castle. He's so sad, she says quietly. Lost, even, like he doesn't recognize what year it is sometimes. Do you see him often? Tonks shakes her head. I've only seen him twice. My mother found him somehow. One day I came home and he was on my couch. Percy grins despite himself, imagining what a scene that must have caused. What did you do? Had him in chains before Mum could tell me to stop, Tonks admits, and there's a small glimmer of pride lurking beneath her muted sorrow. I dunno where he's been, but I saw him a second time that summer, and then he's been off somewhere. He said it wouldn't be safe to contact us. He's definitely right, Percy has to add. Merlin, Tonks, you're an aura. You could be sent to Azkaban if anyone catches wind that you've even seen him, let alone that you and your family is aiding him. But he is family, Percy. So is Draco Malfoy, and I don't see you willing to lose your job over him. Tonks snorts, and Percy's shoulders relax as they once again find themselves on common ground. Well, Sirius was also blasted off the tree, so I reckon that makes him and my mum more like family than her and Lady Malfoy. But Percy, do you know of any way that I can help him? Percy has to shrug helplessly. I don't know very much about Dementor magic. I'm sorry, Tonks. Maybe you can ask a healer. Pretend it's part of your aura training. Maybe all he needs is time. Tonks nods, looking glum, and says very little for the rest of the evening. Percy cannot really understand the depth of her determination, given that she's only spoken to the man twice. But he supposes Tonks has very little family, and so may feel like she has to stick to what she's got. December 1994, with just about 3 months until the second task, Percy throws himself into painting with a single-minded determination. He needs to be skilled enough to render the subtleties of Tom's face. Not for the first time, he thanks his lucky stars that he lives alone. His flat is papered with sketches of Tom's face as he struggles with the curve of his jaw and the bow in his upper lip. Narcissa and he always chat before his weekly lessons, though never again about Tonks or even the tournament. She artfully keeps the conversation light and artificial, pleasant and polite. When Percy retells the story of the scone, one weekend toward the middle of December, she covers her mouth and breaks into giggles. The next week when he's arrived, she's prepared for him a variety of foods appropriate and easy to consume for various types of meetings. If one wishes a meeting to be short, never order any food, merely a drink. Tea gives the impression of cordiality. Alcohol turns the tenor more serious or intimate, depending on the participants. If one desires to trap the other party in conversation, order something expensive that will take time to consume. He tells Tonks about his meetings with Narcissa, and she is quiet, thoughtful. The next time he sees her, she's revealed she sent an owl to Draco. "We're cousins, and he likes you, so he can't be all bad," she reasons. "And what 14-year-old boy doesn't like having a secret from his mum?" Crouch wastes away, seemingly even faster than Percy remembers. He's actively distracted, and at times displays a shocking lack of interest in essential activities. Percy has to take complete control over the regulations concerning international carpets, though he remembers that Crouch had taken it as a personal affront that the foreign contingent wanted to flout their transportation in front of the Muggles, creating a bureaucratic nightmare for the Obliviators. Liam is beginning to be a bit too sure of himself, too, all things considered. Percy knows perfectly well that Liam is a Muggle-born pretending to be otherwise, so he has about a year to leave the department before it becomes unsafe. But given that Percy has this information, he should use it carefully. It bears further consideration. He sometimes sees Liam, chatting and laughing with the purebloods that would turn on him and his people in just a few years, and wants to shake him, break that damn cheerful smile, and tell him that these people do not care about him. They are undoubtedly sniggering about Liam behind his back, trading nasty barbs as to the untidiness of Liam's Muggle trainers or wide ties, his lower-brow ways. Percy burns with second-hand embarrassment to think of it, and he cannot understand why Liam persists in being friends with them despite the class divide that separates them. Aside from learning that Crouch's wife died shortly after their son, Percy does not find very much more of interest in the papers to suggest why Crouch may be dying. Percy does take a leaf out of Tonks' book and watches Barty Crouch Jr.'s trial. It's a horrid business, and Percy feels sick to his stomach the entire evening. Barty's wild, careening laugh, the hard set of Crouch's face as he looks at his own son, the poor Longbottoms, tortured to insanity. He dreams of Barty's laugh that night, and Tom's laugh too, and dark snakes writhing their way across the sky and slipping under the hoods of Dementors blocking out the moonlight. The dark circles under his eyes grow more and more pronounced each night, and he takes to spelling his appearance whenever he can. Bagman is never in his office. Percy chats up Bagman's assistant, a Ravenclaw witch a few years older than he, and she reveals to him casually that Bagman is in the process of selling off his family property. Given that Rookwood is still in Azkaban, Percy cannot imagine who Bagman may be selling information to, but he supposes that plenty of the original Death Eaters are still out and about, enjoying their largesse and privileged positions in society. Percy contemplates the idea of asking Diggory about Bagman's trouble with the goblins, but every time Percy drops by his department to add to the reports he is compiling for Crouch, Diggory watches him with dark, distrustful eyes. Percy has no idea what he's done in this timeline to cause such suspicion, unless his father has been telling tales about him behind his back, which is downright insulting. The night before the Yule Ball, Percy breaks into Crouch's office. It's surprisingly easy. Percy has the proper security credentials, and he's begun to work late. It can only help if he has the reputation of being a bit of a stickler, always at the office, always scrupulously correct. Last week, he cited Liam for wearing trainers under his robes, which is technically against the employee guidelines. So nobody questions him, and he levitates a large stack of nasty-looking papers through the office at 9 in the evening. The new bill for cauldron regulation, Percy explains to the night guard outside the Department of International Cooperation, and the man grins and wishes Percy luck. "It'll take me all night," Percy says, shaking his head. "And I can't even take them home because they're marked as sensitive." "I won't daub on you if you have a bottle or two," the guard says, holding open the door. Drinking is strictly against employee regulations, but Percy only smiles and walks through with his stack of papers. He opens Crouch's door with his wand, keyed to the man's wards, and then separates the stacks into several substacks, in case anyone walks in and wants to see proof that he's been working. Crouch's office is bare. No pictures, of course. He has 3 bookshelves, all with incredibly dry-looking tomes on magical law or international regulations. His enchanted window is firmly bolted shut, though as a department head he could be authorized for basically any view. His chair is leather and delightfully soft. His desk is a deep, beautiful walnut, and each of its 4 drawers are locked. Well, Percy isn't a 2-time Hogwarts graduate for nothing. He first casts what has become one of his favorite spells, what he first used, back in his 4th year, to see which key Flitwick enchanted to the door. All 4 drawers light up a blazing blue, indicating they've been enchanted defensively by the same person. But they each have an orange tinge, which would imply somebody else has recently done precisely what Percy is attempting now. Crouch does have enemies, and has been acting more than a little odd this year. Percy supposes it is not out of the question that someone wants to see what secrets he hides. The drawers, he soon finds, are keyed to Crouch's wand. This is an important discovery and indicates a key weakness in Crouch's defenses. They are not tied to his magic, meaning anybody with his wand could breach the wards. Percy, unfortunately, does not have Crouch's wand. After eventually concluding he won't be able to open the drawer, he makes a valiant attempt to be clever. His studies with McGonagall on elemental magic and transfiguration have left him with a strong understanding of most related material. However, even employing his full repertoire of spells, he's able only to ascertain that the contents of the top 2 drawers are thin sheets of inorganic material, parchment most likely. The bottom drawer has something solid and metal that Percy would guess to be a key. The last drawer seems to have glass, lots of it. Vials, if Percy had to guess. Likely Crouch was taking a stimulant. He certainly would not be the first. Percy stands in front of the desk. Again, he surveys the room, bookshelves. He tips some of the books back, but he doesn't see anything hidden behind. None of them appear to be well used, judging by the uniform layer of dust coating their spines. In fact, much of the room is dusty, even though Percy was under the impression that Crouch was using it often. His eyes land on the wide, ornate grate under the enchanted window. Perhaps Crouch walks into his office, turns on the lights, and goes back to his home. Crouch could, conceivably, be the type to turn down the house elf cleaning services offered to all department heads. Percy would believe Crouch is paranoid enough to not want even a ministry-employed house elf near his personal property. Enchanted window locked. Percy ignores it as he completes a slow turn. There's a large brass floor lamp next to the desk. Keep turning. There's the door, perfectly ordinary. Next to the door on the right is a small table holding up a basket, right under the pipe where memos shoot out. The basket is full. Percy crosses the room and rifles through it. Several of the notes were sent by him and presumably ignored. Well, keep turning. Don't lose focus now. But turning brings the bookshelves yet again into focus. Next to the bookshelf, there is a large, ornate chest. Percy examines it carefully, but none of his unlocking charms have any sort of effect. He notes the pure iron keyhole, covered in tiny runes. It's a standard wizarding chest, tied to a specific wand and key combination. He won't be able to open it without extreme force. Percy sighs out loud and goes back to the basket. At least if he sees where the pileup began, he can theorize when this whole illness started. Memos about the tournament, these Percy copies and sets aside. Lots of missives about the carpet controversy, of course. Some notes from Bagman, begging for an audience. Invitations from foreign ministries that Crouch really should be accepting. Percy pulls out his planner and jots down some reminders to at least apologize for not responding. Requisition forms, courtesy notices in advance of department bills being due, monthly meeting invitations, the type of mundane notifications that are required to keep the wheels of a large, complex government organization turning. And at the bottom of the pile, there's a note from Bertha Jorkins, letting Crouch know she'll be stopping by his house tomorrow to get his signature on some time-sensitive documents. The note is signed from 1 week before her trip to Albania. Percy must be insane, because he is currently contemplating the wisdom of spying on his manager's house. He's not doing it, of course. He's back in his flat, sitting on the couch in the main room and staring at the note from Bertha. Mr. Crouch will be stopping by your house tomorrow at 10 a.m. Urgently needs signatures on the permissions to staff Obliviators at the World Cup. My apologies. Turns out under the new regulations, HBZ 3206, we need to certify each individual Obliviator rather than authorize a block. Thanks, Bertha, that's all it is. Perfectly mundane. Percy remembers regulation HBZ 3206, since one of his jobs had been to reference the budget and work out how many Obliviators they could afford to hire. Answer: 8. Bertha really ought to have had the permission signed well before June, considering the new regulation took effect the previous April, but it could have conceivably slipped her mind. Stopping by Crouch's house is a tad unusual, but not entirely unheard of at the ministry. Especially with the intimacy afforded by Flu, it was not unusual for colleagues to poke their heads into each other's fireplaces before meetings or at the end of the day. Actually showing up to a house is a bit more bold, but if Bertha was truly desperate, and she would have been if the permission forms were still unsigned just weeks before the event, she might risk Crouch's ire for his signatures. There's no proof that this meeting spurred Bertha's trip. Except when he had spoken to Crouch about her, Crouch hadn't mentioned she'd come by his house a week before she left. Not that he had to mention it, per se, but Bertha, being a chatty sort, likely would have mentioned to Crouch that she was leaving for Albania in a week. Percy had checked the employee logs, no record of vacation days taken by Bertha, and so something about the whole situation is just a bit fishy. Maybe Crouch snapped at her, and Bertha fled for vacation, her feelings hurt. Had those forms ever been signed? Had there been Obliviators at the Cup? There must have been. Maybe Bertha had been too intimidated to speak to Crouch, or he didn't remember she'd mentioned Albania. There's no real reason to think that something went wrong during that meeting, something nefarious. And therefore Percy is a bit mad, since he's considering spying on Crouch's house anyway. In the end, he doesn't spy on Crouch's house, but taking a leaf from Bertha's book, he appears with some forms he forgot to sign for the Yule Ball. The actual forms are, of course, already signed and in his office, but he had waited to submit them on the off chance that Crouch was actually paying any meaningful attention to the tournament. Crouch is not in, though he had not come into the office either. He has a nice house in one of the wizarding suburbs fairly near to the Longbottom Manor, though it is not as nice as Percy would have expected from the Crouch family. Perhaps they have a manor somewhere else entirely. Percy knocks on the door smartly, trying to look for the televisor charm as if he is here on perfectly innocuous business. When there is no response, he knocks again with more force. Nothing. Stepping off the main pathway and moving toward the side of the house, he could, conceivably, want to check if Crouch were in the back garden. Percy unobtrusively casts a few spells. To his surprise, he finds that very little magic has been cast in the house at all for at least the last few days, though he would not be able to tell more without more in-depth study. Perhaps Crouch is on vacation or in hospital. Percy peers over the low iron fence into Crouch's backyard. It is empty. There is some space where perhaps once a flower or vegetable garden lived, and an old rusting lawn chair, but nothing else. Percy worries his lip between his teeth. He desperately wants to go inside, but would that be too difficult to explain? Crouch must have charms to detect intruders. Would he be too angry at Percy for walking in, or would he accept Percy's tournament excuse as sufficient? He compromises by casting a more complex version of his earlier charm. It uses enough magic that Crouch's wards may pick up on it, but he thinks he can explain that more easily than breaking and entering. The magic spreads throughout the house like grey mist. After a second later, pockets of mist change color. Outside, where Percy is, a deep yellow hovers near the gate, as if someone just like Percy lingered to cast detection spells. Inside, shades of blue coalesce near some of the doors and in the kitchen. So Crouch has been inside, but not often enough over the last few days for his magic to show in the simpler variant of the spell. With one last look at the house, Percy disappears. He will plan to return in a few days and see if it is still vacant. Crouch could have traveled for the holidays, though to do so without leaving word is strange, to say the least. The Yule Ball, glittering, glamorous, glacial. Percy picks at his food, watching Ron and Harry sulk with only minimal amusement. He tried to meet with Snape, and once again the older man had snapped at him to leave him in peace. Percy can't let that stand, of course. He needs to know, he deserved to know, what news there was from Pettigrew, from Dumbledore. He isn't a child, able to be dismissed and pushed aside because Snape is under a great deal of pressure. Myrtle isn't anywhere to be seen. The ghosts were having their own party, apparently, and Percy was not invited. Her bathroom was cold and damp in her absence, and Percy had stood there for several long seconds, looking at the familiar way the light filters green through the tall slit windows, before he'd reluctantly turned around and left it in peace. Perhaps Percy is the only one not at peace these days, and so Percy feels almost as forlorn as his youngest brother, watching the girl he likes dance with his Quidditch hero. If Percy had liked a girl in years, if Percy watched Quidditch. It's not fair, Ron mutters again to Harry, stabbing a green bean with particular vehemence. The food on all three plates have long gone cold, but neither wizard moves to reheat it with a warming charm. Percy eyes their plates but does not offer. His own he pushes aside. He finds himself eating less and less these days. Just tell her you fancy her, says Percy tiredly. Harry had perked up earlier when Dumbledore had stopped by their table, but when the older wizard had left, the boy who lived had deflated almost immediately. Percy does not like to see it. Ron goes a predictable scarlet. I don't fancy her. Harry eyes Ron doubtfully and reaches for his goblet. His date, a pretty Indian girl in an elaborate and ornate pink sari, twirls laughing in the arms of a handsome French boy in sky-blue robes. Her twin, Ron's date, somehow, is equally radiant in orange. They look much older and sophisticated than Harry and Ron, slouched at the table. Percy had winced when he'd seen Ron's terrible outfit, though that hadn't prevented him from making several mental notes to share with Aunt Muriel the next time he sees her. From across the room, Percy notices Bagman walking toward him purposefully, having just shaken off Fred and George. Percy has no interest in being implicated with Bagman. After what Bill had told them about Bagman's piling debts, his conflict with the goblins, and of course that fishy business with Crouch trying to implicate Bagman for passing information in the First War to Rookwood, Percy is going to stay as far away from the man as he can. I'm going for a walk, Percy announces. You're welcome to sit here and watch your dates. The two teenagers exchange looks and scramble after him. The rose garden is at least cooler than the stifling Great Hall, though there are far too many giggling couples for Percy's tastes. A bug buzzes near his head, and he stuns it irritably with a stupefy, one of the few offensive spells he's mastered wordlessly and wandlessly. It's Snape, Ron hisses suddenly, stopping abruptly. Percy refocuses on his surroundings. Indeed, Snape's voice, as malevolently upset as it was earlier, filters through the bushes up ahead. I don't see what there is to fuss about, Igor, Snape says coolly. Percy exchanges a glance with Ron and then Harry. With their unanimous support, he lifts a quiet privacy charm while they press closer to Percy. Severus, you cannot pretend this isn't happening, Karkaroff says anxiously. It's been getting clearer and clearer for months. I am becoming seriously concerned. I can't deny it, Percy frowns. Then flee, says Snape's voice curtly. Flee. I will make your excuses. I, however, am remaining at Hogwarts. There's a brief scuffle. Snape takes points from a Ravenclaw girl, his voice full of dark glee. Harry shifts, but Percy grabs his robes and pulls him closer to himself. His privacy shield is not particularly large, and he senses the conversation is not over. But Severus, that would be suicide, Karkaroff says urgently. My life is to do with as I wish, Snape says icily. And yours, Igor, to whom does your life belong? Severus. Named you in the trial. You'll die either way. Snape laughs. It is not kind. I know the answer to my question, even if you do not. Igor, flee then. It may be the last thing you do, but you shall die a free man. And you, Severus, you will die in service. I will die when I can do nothing else. The two men walk off, and Percy cancels the privacy charm. Harry's face is drawn and white. Ron looks at him nervously, and then to Percy. Percy shakes his head in response to the unspoken question. He has his suspicions as to what the two men were discussing, but no certainties, and he certainly is not going to share his guesses with Ron and Harry. Karkaroff is a Death Eater, Harry says abruptly. Sirius told me. Percy eyes Harry. Does he not know Snape was one too? He must, particularly if he is corresponding with Sirius Black. Many of the prominent figures in our society were accused, Percy says neutrally. Many claimed imperious, which is impossible to detect after the spell has ended. Like Malfoy's dad, says Ron wisely, nodding. Harry snorts. He definitely wasn't under an imperious. Nobody knows, says Percy, beginning to herd the boys back into the great hall. He wants to be alone to think through what he just heard. The point is, there are always undercurrents to the truth. Nothing is ever simple. He leaves them discussing the matter over the punch bowl. Percy catches a whiff and knows immediately someone has spiked it, most likely the twins, and then quietly leaves the room. He's done his task, technically. He helped open the ceremony. He was Crouch's representative at the ball, and he showed his face long enough to be recognized. Now he wants to be alone. Percy wanders the castle, thinking about Snape. It seems increasingly clear the man is hiding something from him, likely whatever is blackening his mood more than usual. Maybe it's the knowledge that the Dark Lord will soon return and Snape will be pressed into service once more. It's been getting clearer and clearer for months. Can he truly trust Snape? Percy hesitates on the staircase and then chooses to walk up rather than down. On the 7th floor, he pauses and briefly considers the room of hidden things, but he doesn't want to open it and see Ash or remember how idiotic and impulsive he was, perhaps to all of their detriment. He keeps walking up and up and up until there is no more up to go. From the heights of the astronomy tower, the rest of the castle is small and still and silent. The walk to Hogsmeade is lit with floating lights and tall fir trees dotted with snow. The pathway a small curling snake from Percy's vantage point. From up here, he can breathe more freely, as if his problems were smaller and more remote, like the small dark figures moving around on the ground. So what if Snape does not include him in his plans? Percy has gotten this far with the other man's help, and he certainly does not need it to continue. At this stage in the long, complicated game that he and Snape are playing, there is no point in distrusting Snape. Percy has already told Snape enough that if Snape were lying to him, there would be no hope of salvaging the timeline. Lady Ravenclaw, he says into the air, on the off chance that ghosts know when they are summoned. Myrtle certainly has a talent for appearing at the opportune, or inopportune, he supposes, moment. I need to speak with you. A pause, just long enough for Percy to look back down at the dark and expansive grounds, feeling bitter that he is being ignored yet again. And then a dreadful chill falls over the whole landing, despite the warm cloak that Percy is wearing to protect himself against the brisk December air. Lady Ravenclaw, you will not speak to her again, says a voice, low and soft and dangerous, hissing like a potion about to pop and boil. Percy spins around, wand out, but nobody is there. Hominum revelio, he casts, but again nothing. The voice laughs rustily. I am no human boy. Percy grips his wand tighter and raises a shield. Be bold, whispers Tom. Percy tries to project confidence into his voice. Show yourself. I command it. Why do you wish to speak to Lady Ravenclaw? Percy keeps his wand out, scanning the room slowly. My business is my own. With a rattle of chains, the bloody Baron materializes into being. Percy takes a step backward, still holding onto his wand. His shield flickers but then snaps back to the confines of his body. The Baron is tall, taller than Percy would expect from a ghost from his time, and his ancient robes are ornate and covered with silvery blood. The chains he is infamous for are wrapped tightly around his arms, rattling ominously with every shift. Sir, Percy gasps out in surprise. The Baron ignores him. You will not speak to her, he repeats, taking a slow, gliding step toward Percy. His voice is low and intent, and Percy feels the hairs on the back of his neck bristle in warning. What is it you need to know? Percy has never known the Baron to speak before. He licks his dry lips and attempts. Do you know of what was hidden here? Many things are hidden here, the Baron replies. Again his chains rattle. Again he moves closer with that slow, steady glide. Percy takes another step back. But I know of what tortured her. I need to know when it was corrupted, he says, feeling his back bump against the cold, thin railing that separates him from certain death. There may be a charm to protect students from falling, but then again, there may not be, and Percy is not feeling particularly lucky. His statement stops the Baron, at least temporarily, and Percy takes the opportunity to step slightly away from the railing. Why? I need to know in order to destroy it. The Baron looks at Percy, his chains pooling by his feet. Percy tries to raise his chin and look back. though he wants nothing more than to dash away. The Baron's attention is colder than Myrtle's, or even the Grey Lady's. Standing next to him makes Percy feel as though he has plunged into a very old and very still lake in the middle of winter, the type of lake told of in tales of King Arthur or Merlin, with a scaled tail flickering just out of sight as an ancient monster dives to its depth. He shivers despite himself. Finally, the ghost speaks. You wish to destroy it? Yes. Percy hesitates and then adds, we need to destroy it. It is not the only one of its kind. Percy blinks. Do you know the others? The Baron shakes his head slowly and with an air of finality. I do not know. Well, I can't say why, but it's important that I know when this was created as accurately as possible, Percy says urgently. He brought it with him when he requested to join the staff, the Baron replies, the air suddenly leaving his ghostly lungs in a sonorous hiss. I do not know the year. I have not known the year for many centuries. Percy nods gratefully. Thank you, sir. The bloody Baron inclines his head. He begins sinking through the floor and then pauses, only his torso showing. Destroy them all. That's the plan, sir. The Baron looks up and meets his gaze for the first time. The weight of it sears. All of them, he repeats. Do not falter. I won't, he says, startled, as the Baron sinks away as if settling into a murky marsh. Young Tom, then. Snape would know the date, or at least be able to find it. Percy's halfway to the dungeons before it occurs to him to wonder why the Baron came when he called. Percy is forced to visit Snape again in the morning, on account of professors being forced to stay at the Yule Ball until its conclusion. He's not very enthused about it. The only thing worse than confronting Snape is confronting him the day after a night chaperoning drunk teenagers. Percy wakes early and fritters away the entire morning by rehearsing what he's going to say. He strides purposefully to the dungeons. He knocks firmly on Snape's office door, and he enters with authority. The Dark Lord is gaining strength, Snape says without preamble, cutting him off at the knees before he can even hope to stand. My mark is darkening. That is what you came to ask, is it not? I saw your pathetic attempt at a privacy ward last night. Percy contemplates a variety of answers before saying, cautiously, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to spy. Snape gives him a derisive look, but continues, turning to the empty chalkboard as if he's reading from his lesson plans. Igor is a fool. He's unlikely to survive the next year if this timeline proceeds as we expect. I do not believe he entered Potter's name. He does not want the Dark Lord to return. Why? He fled the service. He named names, Snape says simply. The only reward for his cowardice will be death. But Malfoy, Greengrass not. They all pled imperious. Snape barks out a tired laugh. The Dark Lord may even be amused by that defense. Igor may survive if he is willing to turn Durmstrang into a stronghold for the Dark Lord, but his control on the school is far more tenuous than he thinks. No, death is certain. Are you? Fine with that, sir. Snape turns and gives Percy a poisonous glare. Are you fine with Crouch dying? That's inevitable, stammers Percy, taken aback. Snape turns to the board again, clasping his hands behind his back. So is this. He gives Percy only a minute to process before he continues. So the new year abounds. We have no news from Pettigrew, but whatever he's doing must be working. We must assume the plan remains the same. I have been monitoring the map, but I see no extraneous names. The map is laying open on Snape's desk. Percy takes it and scans, but everything does as it should. McGonagall is in her quarters, likely sleeping off a hangover. Most of the students are in their dorms doing the same. Dumbledore isn't on the map that Percy can see, though he was there at the ball last night. Sprout is in the greenhouses. Flitwick is in the Ravenclaw common room. Moody is in his office. What do you say of my theory that Dumbledore is responsible? Increasingly plausible, replies Snape, still surveying the endless canvas of an empty blackboard. Percy wonders what he's seeing inscribed in his mind. I believe it may also have been Moody. Moody. Moody is acting with more than his usual paranoia, Snape says, and the sneer curling his lip is enough to hint to Percy what exactly has been driving Snape into heightened levels of irritation. He's being deliberately belligerent with me and Igor, and I've spotted him trying to cozy up to Potter. But why would he enter Harry in the tournament? Snape sighs, as if the very effort of explaining to Percy requires more energy than he can bear. He turns, and with excruciating slowness, takes the 3 steps to his desk, pulls out his chair, and then perches on the edge. Only then does he look up and meet Percy's eyes. Bait, bait, Percy repeats. Nobody hates dark wizards more than Alastor Moody, Snape explains, his mouth small and compressed. And what better way to draw out dark wizards than to dangle the boy who lived, vulnerable and alone, in a dangerous magical contest? Do you think Dumbledore would know of this? Snape shrugs one shoulder. Moody is Albus' man, through and through, but he disagrees often with him. He thinks Albus needs to be more decisive. This may be the kind of plan that Moody uses to win support for his goals, that is, to establish an aura presence in Hogwarts and begin preparing for the Second War. Percy thinks about what's to come. That's not a bad idea, actually. Snape slams his hand on the desk with some force, causing Percy to jump where he stands. It's a terrible idea, he hisses vehemently. The last thing we want to do is telegraph to the Dark Lord that we're preparing for his return. Think, boy. What is he likely to do if he believes we're ready for him? Percy knows what he would do, first thing. It's something he's always wondered about the Horcruxes. Why have them so inaccessible? Check on the Horcruxes. We have to assume the Dark Lord can sense their destruction, since we do not know otherwise. But consider the disaster it would be if he took the rest into his stronghold before we even knew what they were. No. Our only advantage is that he thinks we will be unprepared for him. We need to ensure it remains that way. Strike only where he cannot see, Percy completes, nodding. He starts to bring up his dilemma, whether to purposefully estrange himself for his family or not, but then closes his mouth abruptly. He's not so sure he wants to know what Snape thinks. Snape takes advantage of Percy's silence to steeple his fingers and regard Percy thoughtfully. You truly believe this portrait will be successful? Yes, Percy says instantly. He takes a seat on the opposite side of the desk and reaches into his bag for one of the books that he brought to bolster his argument. We do not know where the others could be. He sees Snape start to open his mouth and then quickly continues. We can't wait for Dumbledore. What if he does not tell Harry until he is of age? We do not know whether you ever knew about them. What remains unsaid is that Dumbledore is almost certainly aware now what the diary is and has yet to confide in Snape. Likely he never will. And you think this portrait will be of use. Percy flips to a section in the book, marked by a slender leather bookmark. He points to the relevant section and leans back while Snape peruses it intently. Snape exhales through his nose heavily. This is a risk, he says, one long finger tapping the text. The skill required to even animate the portrait may very well be beyond our reach. The audacity to assume that we can do so with purpose is, well, unthinkable. What the text says is this. Humans are notoriously mercurial. Portraits are but shades of living people. A skilled portrait master can imbue his work with a convincing facsimile of emotion, but he should take care not to accidentally allow his own to take precedence. What Percy understands is this. It is possible, somehow, to imbue one's own emotions in a work. Perhaps he can make Tom more pliable, or at least receptive to Percy's friendship. The risk is fairly low, Percy persists. The largest risk is, admittedly, that we destroy the diadem in the process, but I think it is unlikely that he can feel their destruction, given that the trio, somehow, managed to destroy them all without the Dark Lord noticing. That is mere conjecture. Percy forges on. A portrait, especially in a place with only one portrait, is highly limited in scope. It cannot go anywhere or cast magic. It can only speak. It can lie, says Snape. Consider that it will lie, and we will die while following its instructions. We don't need to turn off our brains, argues Percy. Even its misdirection could be informative. Where would we keep it? In Hogwarts, where it may be seen at all times. In your apartment, where it's liable to worm its way into your head as capably as its 16-year-old predecessor. Percy flushes. He had been thinking he'd keep it in his apartment, where he could speak to it freely, like he did Tom. Not to confide in it, or seek validation, or anything like Snape's imagining. But Percy got more out of Tom than Ginny could, or Harry, or Snape. He understands Tom, at least the younger version of Tom, so wrapped up in his ideas of glory and power and influence. Having him there would be useful. Snape eyes him. You are already in his thrall. I am not, Percy exclaims, his head shooting up. Gringotts, then, he says, hoping the idea sounds well-reasoned and not like he just thought of it. We'll put it in my vault in Gringotts. Snape purses his lips and leans back slightly. Percy, having taken over a decade of lessons with the man, knows perfectly well that this means he's taking Percy's ideas seriously. You will paint it first, he concedes. I believe it will take me much of the term to complete the potion. We cannot hurry this process, Mr. Weasley. Percy, he corrects as a matter of course, though without much hope. Snape ignores him, but Percy is too elated at Snape's acquiescence to mind too much. January 1995, Mr. Barrington is not exactly how Percy would imagine a master portrait artist, but he's close. Tall, thin, and very old, with a shock of grey hair and gnarled fingertips. His voice rarely rises above a hoarse whisper, and despite the clear case of advanced arthritis in his wrinkled hands, his hands are steady and firm while holding the paintbrush. To make a true portrait, the brush itself must be a wand, he tells Percy, turning over the brush that he uses. You must focus on your subject and allow your magic to flow into every stroke, every line. Do you need to know your subject well, sir? Barrington shakes his head, his thumb smoothing over the bristles at the end of the brush. No, although it helps. The potion is what replicates the subject, imbues your painting with something more. Yes, Mr. Weasley, to become a master portrait artist is more than applying paint to a blank canvas. It takes many years of study. You must be capable of sustaining a meditative state for hours on end, allowing your magic to move freely throughout your body. You must bring it to the surface and keep it there, tethered. Percy nods slowly, committing it to memory. I do not take on many students, Mr. Weasley. For trifles such as this, for you realize, I hope, your painting of your father will be merely animated, not alive. I believe most can learn, with the requisite instruction, to replicate what we see on the page. But I will not take on a student who wishes to be a master unless they are truly worthy. Percy has not quite planned that far. In truth, he knows he will likely need to complete the portrait of Tom on his own. He cannot risk a single person other than Snape knowing of his plans. But the art calls to him nevertheless, and he will not rule out the possibility that he may one day come to this wizened old man and beg him to take him as a student. I wish to be worthy, he says intently. Beside them, the painting of Arthur, still in its rudimentary stages, smiles serenely. We shall see, Barrington says. He dreams of Tom sometimes. His flat is papered with sketches of Tom's face, of rudimentary attempts at painting him, of the way his eyes flash and his lips purse, and the arresting stillness of his gaze. He smells the paints constantly, in the middle of the night, shifting on his pillow, in the ministry, wafting from his fingers as he shuffles papers, in the morning, lingering on his robes as he pulls them on over his clothes. Bring me back, says Tom, in the middle of the night, his voice urgent and low. I need you to help me, Percy. He wakes with an ache in his throat and an uncomfortable uneasiness in his stomach, the feeling of a sob caught before it erupts, a prickly, uneasy impatience dusting his collarbone, and finds his fingers clenched tightly around his wand, as if it were his brush. The new year brings surprisingly mild weather. Percy, whose moods often track the weather closely, dampening and sobering as the sky turns dark, and lightening whenever a few inspired beams of sun break through the foggy overhead, spends as much of the weekend as he can outside. England's winter weather is more preferable to him than the tumultuous, stormy Scotland, but he still wishes sometimes that it didn't rain all the bloody time. Perhaps when this war is over, he'll pack up and move to the south of France, somewhere where the sun shines for more of the year, yet there isn't the heavy oppressive heat that Bill suffered through in Egypt. The new year also brings an unpleasant surprise. Amos Diggory is found dead, the Diggory home unexpectedly bursting into flames on one of the rare sunny evenings that Percy has been enjoying so. Percy lingers behind the squad of Aurors called to the scene and apparats a few minutes after them, not least because the Diggory residence is so close to the burrow. His father is there too, likely for the same reason, and after both Weasleys get snapped at by the lead Auror when they try to enter the still-smoking house, they stand outside, shoulder to shoulder, and watch. Priscilla wasn't there, Arthur tells Percy in an undertone, watching sadly as the Aurors struggle with a combined hydration spell. Percy would tell the lead Auror that he needs a firmer wrist, and that the other three need to join the spell at precisely the same time rather than staggering their incantations. But he has already been told once to bugger off, and does not need to invite the same response twice. She was in Hogsmeade, apparently. Crouch authorized some of the parents to visit their children after that horrid Rita Skeeter article. Marley tried to get authorized for Harry, but he refused. Arthur hesitates, but Percy can hear the next question as clearly as if his father had shouted it from the crumbling rooftops. "No, I didn't tell Mr. Crouch to keep Mother off the list," Percy responds irritably. "I didn't know she'd asked. I didn't know the parents were in Hogsmeade at all. He should have known, unless Crouch had deputized the task to Liam." Arthur clears his throat and turns the subject back to the Diggories, rightfully uncomfortable at his own son catching him in such a blatant display of distrust. Amos stayed behind. Merlin knows why. Can't imagine he would have missed a chance to see Cedric. But I suppose he had a meeting with the goblins later today. Likely that'll be cancelled, which I'm sure will tick them off. Goblins aren't exactly the patient sort. Percy narrows his eyes. He does not need to be an aura to find this whole fiasco rather suspicious. Goblins makes him think immediately of Bagman, of course. Perhaps Bagman is actually a Death Eater and organized the murder of Amos Diggory. Percy can hardly believe it of the man, but then again, appearances can be deceiving. Crouch certainly doesn't trust Bagman, for obvious reasons, and Bagman is not overly fond of Crouch either, given that Crouch was the one who tried to lock Bagman up in Azkaban. Percy goes with Crouch to meet with Cedric and Priscilla and inform him of Amos' death. It is a horrid scene that turns Percy's stomach. Priscilla dissolves into sobs almost immediately, and even Crouch's impassive demeanor cracks, and he looks openly uncomfortable. Cedric tears up too, his face turning blotchy and red, and he suddenly looks much younger than his 17 years. The worst bit of the whole thing is that Crouch tells Cedric that he can't drop out of the tournament. "Magically, you're bound, I'm afraid," Crouch says, and perhaps Percy is imagining the glimmer of frustration in Crouch's eyes. Does Crouch think of his own son when he looks at Cedric? Crouch had not let his own flesh and blood off the hook when it came to serving time for his crimes, so Percy cannot imagine that he'd let Cedric drop from the tournament, even if he were allowed. Later, when Percy is back in his apartment, avoiding looking at Tom's painted eyes, he thinks again of Cedric with a great lurch in his stomach. If all goes according to plan, Cedric is going to die at the end of the year too, and then Priscilla Diggory will be all alone. Oh, Merlin. Percy has been trying to convince himself all year that Cedric has to die. They honestly, truly, unfortunately cannot be certain that the Dark Lord does not need a sacrifice to come back to life. And if that sacrifice won't be Cedric, how can Percy pick a replacement? But how can Percy let Cedric just walk to his death? But the Dark Lord has to return. He has to return, otherwise he may return at another time, when they are not prepared for it, and do not have the upper hand. Percy knows that if he were to raise the point of Cedric to Snape again, Snape would tell him crisply and shortly that sacrifices are necessary in a war, as regrettable as they may be. Percy blinks away tears and turns back to the portrait of Tom. Perhaps if he can finish the portrait quickly enough, Tom could give them a hint as to what potion the Dark Lord uses to return, and they can determine if a sacrifice truly is needed. February 1995, but before Percy can really begin in earnest on Tom's painting, there's the second task to get through. In all honesty, after the excitement of the first task, the rest are fairly boring. There's nothing to see below the lake. Percy muses idly that they really ought to have cast some televisor charms. Bagman is at the task. Strictly speaking, he's not in charge of the tournament, though as head of the Department of Games, it is technically in his purview. Percy greets him and then goes to sit next to Professor McGonagall, who's looking a bit anxious. Percy scans the crowd, but Crouch has not yet arrived. "You didn't happen to see Potter on your way here?" Percy checks his watch. The task is scheduled to begin in 5 minutes. The other champions are by the lake, shivering and talking among themselves in low tones, but Harry is nowhere to be found. "Do you think he's skipping?" Percy asks, only to be interrupted by the spectacle of Harry Potter tearing his way as if possessed across the grounds, still dressed in his Gryffindor robes. McGonagall rolls her eyes tartly and relaxes in her seat. "There is something to be said about the provision banning underage boys," she sniffs. "No sense of time." Percy watches Harry cram a slimy green plant into his mouth. Gillyweed. Surprisingly clever for Harry, who, as far as Percy knows, isn't a particularly skilled potioneer. "Severus is looking at you like you've ruined his potion," says McGonagall conversationally as Harry grows gills, falls choking to the ground, and sticks his head under water with a relieved flinch of his body. Really not a very inspired performance by the boy who lived. Percy shifts to meet Snape's gaze, and then whips his head around back to face the lake. He mentally reviews his last few weeks, but can't think what he could have possibly done to merit such a hate-filled glare. I haven't the slightest idea what I've done, Percy admits. McGonagall quirks her lips. You better run when this is all over, then. Fleur emerges, spluttering and angry. She sits, impossibly beautiful, wrapped in a towel by the side of the lake, and glowers darkly at its depths. Percy eyes her. He has absolutely no idea how she and Bill even meet, let alone get married. He hadn't been at the wedding, and in this timeline, it's growing increasingly unlikely he'll be at this one. Because it just makes sense, really. His family is well protected. They have each other. They have Dumbledore. Much better to have a spy on the inside. Crumb is next. McGonagall murmurs in appreciation of his half-transfiguration. Though I really wonder how his legs powered that head, she says quietly to Percy, who snorts. Hermione watches interestedly as Crumb casts a spell non-verbally or in shark language, and the grey skin melts away. Then Cedric, whose bubblehead charm is perfectly accurate, though lacking style. Cho Chang doesn't seem to care if her adoring gaze is any indication. Cedric smiles weakly at her and then glances toward the stands. It does not take a Legilimens to know that he is seeking out his mother, who has a conspicuously empty seat next to her for Amos. Percy watches as Cedric turns dispiritedly back to Cho, who reaches out with one slender finger to trace over the bow of his lower lip as she murmurs quietly to him, an intimate gesture that coaxes a smile out of the teenager. "Where is that blasted boy?" grumbles McGonagall, shifting uncomfortably in the brisk February air as Harry refuses to materialize. "He's not in any real danger, is he?" McGonagall shakes her head. "Well, if he does something remarkably stupid, like remain in the bottom of the lake when whatever thing he took wears off, he'll be beyond saving, but nothing in that lake would purposefully kill a student, and your brother will be perfectly safe regardless. Bagman thought of the tasks, didn't he?" "I believe so," she says. They share a glance of mutual commiseration before McGonagall, looking again at her watch, proposes they move closer to the water's edge. Harry emerges minutes later, gasping, Ron and the Delacour girl bobbing next to him. Despite himself, Percy feels a bit of relief. Ron does not appreciate Percy's efforts to get him properly dried and examined by Madame Pomfrey, as if he were not a 14-year-old boy tied up under water for a full hour. Percy ignores all of Ron's moans and doesn't release him back into Harry's care until he's been properly taken care of by the hospital matron. Harry, of course, remains soaking wet, having made absolutely no effort on a drying charm. Honestly, the boy seems to forget he's a wizard. Luckily, Madame Pomfrey is on his case next. There's a furious consultation that Percy is unfortunately excluded from, though Crouch, one as usual, seems to have several things to say. Percy catches Dumbledore's gaze by accident and turns away abruptly. Aside from the few minutes at the Yule Ball when Dumbledore had chatted with Harry about chamber parts, of all things, Percy has not been within speaking distance of Dumbledore for months. Percy has nothing to report, given that he had not reported anything in the prior timeline, and he does not know what he wants, or does not want, Dumbledore to know. The easiest path of resistance has been to avoid the headmaster and hope for the best. "Professor," he asks while they wait for the judges to deliberate, "did you ever teach Bertha Jorkins?" "Of course," McGonagall responds, surprised. "Yes, and she was. Well, I worked closely with her. I heard of her disappearance. Have you any news?" "She was what?" He hesitates before asking his next question, but he needs somebody to talk to, and Snape seemingly is not an option. "Well, I found out that a week before she mysteriously went to Albania, she went by Crouch's house on the weekend to have him sign some forms." McGonagall is nothing if not sharp. She glances up to where Crouch is arguing heatedly with Madame Maxime in the judge's box and then back to Percy. "You suspect him?" "Not precisely," he equivocates. "I doubt that Mr. Crouch did anything intentionally malicious, but I think her decision to leave the country may be related. Mr. Crouch can be unkind," McGonagall completes dryly. "Bertha is a bit forgetful, a bit superfluous, but she is tough when it comes down to it. I do not think even Mr. Crouch's ire would cause her to flee." Do you know of any reason she may go to Albania? She has a second cousin there, I believe, or maybe an aunt, muses McGonagall. But I don't believe she's ever visited before. I think she must have encountered trouble. Bertha is fairly capable, so I really cannot agree with the perception that she merely missed a train. Just then, Dumbledore announces the scores, interrupting whatever else McGonagall may have to say about Bertha. Percy conceals his irritation and turns to where Dumbledore is standing with arms outstretched, presiding over the stands. Harry, despite nearly missing the task, breaking the rules by rescuing 2 hostages, and emerging well after the time limit, receives 45 points to thunderous applause. Percy rolls his eyes to himself. Moral fiber. He does not know why Snape disagrees with him that Dumbledore clearly is responsible for Harry's inclusion in the tournament. All of these challenges seem tailor-made to convince Harry both of the importance of his moral fiber and of his competency in advanced magical challenges. If Harry Potter can take on a dragon at 14 and win, why would he hesitate to take on a Dark Lord at 17? Well done, Potter, says Crouch, pausing to speak to Harry on his way out of the stadium. Harry, starry-eyed after a kiss from Fleur, has to visibly blink and refocus on Crouch. Thanks. Mr. Weasley, report back to my office after the weekend, Crouch says, and then leaves without another word. Bit weird, innit? Ron says under his breath to Harry, who shrugs uncomfortably. Madame Pomfrey begins herding the champions back to the castle. Percy follows behind, falling into line with McGonagall. My office now, Snape says, his voice like thunder, surprising Percy into a violent flinch. Now, Severus, chides McGonagall. What possible reason could you have for speaking to the poor boy in that tone? Percy does not particularly appreciate being called a poor boy, especially since McGonagall's voice has a glimmer of humor, but he wisely stays silent. He knows what he did, Snape says darkly, and Percy has no choice but to trail silently after his ex-professor and occasional co-conspirator. Snape says nothing until they complete the tortuously long walk, but his anger rolls over him in tangible waves. The door slams. Snape turns on Percy. Explain this, he hisses. Percy follows Snape's arms, his long fingers pointing to O. It wasn't me, Percy protests immediately. The door to Snape's supply cabinet has been forced open, though the contents appear undamaged. Gillyweed, Snape says incredulously. You mean to tell me that Harry Potter, a boy without an ounce of talent in any subject, let alone the delicate art of potions, would somehow think to employ the rare and subtle properties of gillyweed? It really wasn't me, Percy insists. I haven't spoken to Harry in weeks. Best I can remember, he did the same thing last time. Also, I would have told you that I needed gillyweed rather than break into your office. Though you might believe otherwise, Snape, I do not lie to you. Granger would never dare to break in here, Snape says without acknowledging Percy's words, turning to examine the cupboard door once again. Weasley's got even fewer brains than Potter, if such a thing is possible. It was probably Potter, the entitled cretin, though I can't believe he thought of gillyweed. There's no wizard magic here, but perhaps elf. It was probably Dumbledore. Snape takes the map out of his robes and examines it closely. Moody is in his office, he mutters to himself. If the man has the audacity to interfere with my personal possessions. Snape, says Percy cautiously, not liking the ugly look in the other man's eye. What have you done with the diadem? Snape looks up, and the rage in the creased lines of his face is enough to cause Percy to take a cautious step back. You dare insinuate my outrage is due to the diadem, he hisses. You dare insinuate I lack the necessary control to protect against its influence. Get out, Weasley. I have more things to do than to entertain what has been among my greatest disappointments. Percy steels himself. In a way, Snape's last comment could be taken as a compliment if Percy ignores everything else about it. I think Bertha found something in Crouch's home to tip her off about Albania. Do you think I care about Bertha Jorkins? Snape is definitely shouting now. Percy takes another backward step toward the door. If it hasn't escaped you, Weasley, we are fighting a war. We've barely 4 months until the Dark Lord returns. You've destroyed the only clue we've got, and we have nothing to go on, yet you insist on wasting our precious time on witches and paintings. Prancing around Hogwarts like you were so bloody smart. What was the point of 7 years of studying soul magic if you can't even find one Horcrux? Stung, Percy takes another step back. Well, what are you doing? Lying to Albus because of your asinine plan, Snape says, instantly ready to attack. Studying the diadem to see if we can even separate the soul for your painting, trying to figure out which Death Eaters will come when he calls, and Moody tailing me like a dog after a bone. This outburst seems to have exhausted Snape. He turns away from Percy, making a show of examining the map. Percy makes a mental note to complete the painting as soon as possible. He doesn't like what the diadem, or sheer stress, is doing to his partner. Your Crouch is wandering the woods, Snape says into the silence. He looks as if he's being poisoned slowly. Note the way his cheeks are sinking into themselves and his brow is always damp. Something is taking his life force. Who would want to kill Crouch? Snape laughs tiredly. Take your pick of any Death Eater. He's actually looking better this time around. Well, he's acting a bit strange, but last time he skipped most of the tasks. Perhaps this time someone convinced him it was important to go, says Snape thoughtfully. I believe it not unlikely it is Lucius poisoning Crouch. As in your timeline, Fudge will hardly last another year as minister. Crouch would be a natural contender for his successor. And if Lucius is worried that the Dark Lord will be upset with him for claiming Imperius, he can always point out that he is on track to become the minister, Percy completes thoughtfully. Lucius is at the ministry a surprising amount. Percy remembers the strange private smile that had crossed Lucius' mouth at the Quidditch World Cup when the other wizard had asked about Crouch. He adds, Bertha Jorkins visited Crouch's house the week before she disappeared. I thought perhaps he threatened her or scared her into running away, but McGonagall said it was unlikely Bertha would be the type to scare so easily. Snape's gaze sharpens, and some of the wild anger leaves the lines of his face. Did she? He turns to face Percy again. Bertha was part of the Order. Really? That explains McGonagall's slip. Of course she knows Bertha. She was one of them. I do not think somebody frightened her to fleeing, Snape agrees. Crouch would certainly be abreast of the rumors concerning the Death Eaters. I've noticed he makes a point to speak to Karkaroff whenever he is here. He would know that Albania was the last known location of the Dark Lord's shade. You think he knows the Dark Lord is going to return soon? Percy had never gotten that impression in either timeline. You have to understand Crouch Weasley. He's obsessed with the Dark Lord, more than you, more than I. Snape looks old and tired. He blames him for taking away his son, and therefore causing his wife to die of grief. The whole scandal stripped Crouch of any chance at minister, though previously he was well on track to ascend to that position. So you agree Bertha may have seen something in his house related to Albania? This makes more sense than his half-formed theory that Crouch had somehow frightened Bertha into a rather unfortunate vacation, or the more implausible idea that Crouch had forced her to go. Snape nods. Why have a tournament this year and invite Durmstrang? He told me it was Karkaroff's idea. Snape looks faintly surprised. Perhaps, he allows. Perhaps it was even Bagman's idea. But it very much required Crouch's approval, and Crouch is nothing if not opportunistic. Perhaps he even sent Bertha there intentionally to investigate. Percy frowns. So you think it was Crouch who put Harry's name in the goblet? The ugly look returns to Snape's eyes. I'm not convinced Potter didn't enter himself. There doesn't seem to be anything else to say. Percy mumbles that he's working on the painting. Snape nods once, and then Percy walks away. Myrtle is waiting for him outside Snape's office, her ghostly face alight with a grey pallor. Percy does not admit out loud that he is relieved to see her, but he feels some of the tension in his shoulders unwind. I saw Harry, she says triumphantly. I helped him with the clue and in the lake. I know everything about the lake, you know. Percy raises an eyebrow as he continues walking toward the exit. Look at you, invaluable to the champions. Don't mock me, Myrtle pouts. I have nothing else to do now that you have left and don't include me in your plans. I have no plans. Well, why don't you tell me everything I've missed? You know, it'll make you feel better to say it all out loud. This is actually true. Percy has driven 2 sets of roommates mad around exam times, though Alexander would always happily listen to Percy verbally reviewing the material. Percy maintains that's the only way the boy passed all 7 years. They veer right, going to the 2nd floor, and then to the familiar bathroom. Percy conjures a chair and sits, interlocking his fingers. Well, there's 5, no 6 main categories, he begins. What are the other Horcruxes? Where are the other Horcruxes? Can we use a painting to animate the diadem? What is happening in Albania? What is happening to Crouch? And what happens in the third task to bring back the Dark Lord? 7. Where the third task drama unfolds, Myrtle adds. You said once that Harry claimed it was a graveyard. Yes, 7. He must be getting tired. Myrtle hums thoughtfully. Well, I think you probably can't solve what or even where the Horcruxes are unless you invent some spell to track them. I am trying, but it is proving to be devilishly difficult, Percy sighs. For the latter, I was thinking I could find the orphanage, as well as the Gaunt's ancestral home. He was from London, Myrtle says. What? When I was at Hogwarts, there was a Muggle war. Lots of bombing. My family wanted to send me to the country, but since I was coming to Scotland, there was no need. Right, says Percy impatiently. And Tom knew about the bombings, too. When I was a ghost, I spied on him sometimes, and I heard him ask Dippet once if he could stay at Hogwarts over the holidays. So you think he lived in London? That would certainly narrow the scope. There was bombing all over England, but London's my best bet, Myrtle says, nodding. His accent, too. But I really do think you should wait for the painting, Percy. Well, that's issue number 3. I'm taking lessons, but Myrtle portrait artists spend their entire lives training. Percy thinks dispiritedly of the portrait of his father, sitting mournfully in Malfoy Manor. Myrtle shrugs. You don't have to become a master, she points out. You only ever need to paint one portrait. Easier said than done. Well, in the meantime, I'm just about drowning at work. Crouch is acting very hard, and he's given me most of his responsibility. He briefly fills in Myrtle on what he and Snape discussed regarding Bertha Jorkins. She adjusts her glasses. What did she see? Sorry. You said she saw something in his house. What would she have seen that would cause her to go off to Albania and investigate? Unless Snape is correct, and Crouch sent her there, but that seems out of character for him. Percy doesn't have a ready answer for this. Perhaps Crouch's notes, or a photograph, or an article, or a report. It's a good question, actually. Myrtle, as usual, has gone straight to the heart of the problem. Seems to me you need to think about Crouch, Myrtle says, clearly enjoying her role as confidant. I'm thinking about breaking into his house. That's the stage of my life I'm in right now, Myrtle. It's utterly depressing. Myrtle waves aside Percy's existential crisis and says instead, I suppose it does not really matter where Tom is hiding now, given it would be extraordinarily stupid to show up and tip him off. I suppose, Percy agrees unwillingly. He still thinks it is worth investigating where the Dark Lord will return, but Myrtle's right. It isn't as if they can just show up and spy on him. So you ought to think about Bertha, and about whether poor Cedric needs to die, finishes Myrtle, as if it were as easy as anything to do either of those things. You can't do it all, Percy, but you can't do nothing either. Percy exhales slowly and then nods. She's right, and he knows it. He has to stay focused. Otherwise it'll be like the time he tried to brew too many potions, and they all boiled over before he could complete any of them. Percy had not enjoyed Snape's triumph then, and he shudders to think what Snape would say to him now if the same occasion occurred. I've got to go back to work, he apologizes. But thank you, Myrtle. Keep an eye on Snape, will you? I'm worried about him. She salutes him cheerfully. Your mind is always tangled. Can't hurt to untangle it every now and again. His mind is tangled, he muses as he heads back to his apartment. Between timelines, the former so far back in his memory now to feel distant and unreal, and the present increasingly duplicitous. He sometimes can't keep straight who he is or what he's doing. He has to focus on discrete tasks if they're to have any hope at all. March 1995, despite saying otherwise to Myrtle, Percy also begins visiting graveyards. This task is surprisingly more pleasant than visiting orphanages, if only because Percy is nearly always the only one there. He visits Godric Hollow, the place of the Dark Lord's defeat, and leaves flowers on the graves of James and Lily Potter. Aside from the very strong Muggle-repelling charm on the memorial and remains of the house, there's not much here to see, though the small wizarding village is very carefully and prettily maintained. It's the type of village that he privately believes his mother would have enjoyed living, had they enough money to move out of Ottery and Catchpole. It does strike him, looking at the graves, how impossibly young poor James and Lily were. Married right out of school, like his own parents, with a baby on the way right after that. Why did they feel so compelled to rush into domesticity? Did they not need to build their careers? James, of course, must have been quite wealthy. Was it the war pressing down on them? Percy thinks back to the lonely years of the war, where he flinched at every shadow in the ministry and resolutely turned his heart off to the atrocities committed in the name of bureaucracy. He can't imagine how anyone found love in those times, so he supposes as a corollary, if one already had love, one would hold on tight. Still, 21 years old and at the end of one's life, Percy is older than the parents of the boy who lived, which is a rather odd thought. The next graveyard he visits is Myrtle's. The flower arrangement he lies on her grave is significantly more ornate, and he snaps a few pictures to keep her happy. Again, he sets a ward, but sees nothing out of the ordinary. He doesn't really expect anything to happen to Myrtle's grave, given as Tom Riddle barely remembered her in the chamber. The third graveyard is where Tom's mother, Merope, lays, as far as he can tell. It's a guess, really, and he can't find her specific gravestone, though it is the closest public graveyard to the place of her death, assuming the Gaunt family hadn't taken her body elsewhere. He looks nearby for orphanages, but does not find any he hadn't already visited. And finally, he goes to a town he's never heard of, Little Hangleton, where Tom Riddle, S.R., died. This graveyard is much spookier than the rest. It's in the shadow of a large, abandoned manor that looks as if it were from a novel, complete with quiet groaning in the wind and ominous thorns curling up the great iron gates. Compared to the quiet elegance of Malfoy Manor, its dark, forbidding grounds seem weary and sad. Percy shivers, holding his cloak closer to himself. Whatever grandeur this town once saw, it clearly passed on years ago. He'd passed a tiny, nasty shack on the path to the graveyard that looked full of disease and long since abandoned. It isn't hard to find Tom Riddle's grave. What is odd is the sheer number of Riddles that pepper the graveyard. They must have lived here for generations, perhaps in the great manor above. Percy has failed to find the Gaunt ancestral grounds, but he just may have found the Riddles. It makes sense, somehow, that Tom comes from wealth and power on both sides, even if the Gaunts were said to have fallen on hard times. His features are fine and aristocratic, and he holds himself with the carry of a more assured boy. The graveyard shows no real signs of disturbance. Riddle after Riddle sleeps quietly in the dark, still ground. Percy sets up his alarm ward, and then on second thought, casts several more. He feels instinctively as though this will be the graveyard Tom picks to return, in the shadow of his father's manor, his rebirth on his father's grave.